Hi, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Lisa Haber-Thompson, and I am a lecturer here in architecture in the Department of Architecture and co-organizer of today's event alongside my colleague, Dana McKinney-White, who is Assistant Professor of Urban Design in the Department of Urban Planning and Design. Welcome today. We would like to begin by thanking everyone who made it possible for us to convene today, Dean Whiting and the Dean's Office for supporting this event, to the GSD's Communications and Events team, and in particular, Kate Chavez, Raquel Rivera, Matt Smith, and most especially Paige Johnson for her tireless work in orchestrating today's events and many of the public lectures at the GSD. The Institute's End Mass Incarceration for standing as a partner today, in helping extend this reach beyond the design school of this event, and for the support of the many others behind the scenes who often go unrecognized, but who are crucial in everything that we do at the GSD, Huberto Tejada and Edgar Juarez and their teams from Building Services for setting everything up. So thank you. I want to begin today by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. At the design school, our scholarship, design, and research is inexorably tied to the earth and to indigenous lands. We acknowledge the history of dispossession here where we live, work, design, conduct research, collect data, in some recognizing that our drafting boards were never already blank. We want to take a further moment to acknowledge the several unfolding catastrophes occurring right now across the world. And we recognize that this violence is close to home among many in our community. As we embark on today's discussions, evaluating the critical and often emotional landscape of the carceral system, we seek to do so with compassion and grace, recognizing that each of our lived experiences, views, and beliefs stand to enrich what we hope can be an empathetic dialogue together. Okay, so I want to begin by setting the stage a little bit today, because the ways that the history of prison architecture has been told is particular. And it is from this history that we have inherited specific ideas about how the related design disciplines relate to carcerality. So to frame this event today, I wanted to set the stage a little bit by talking about how the architectural history of the prison building has been told in the past, and also to call attention to the deliberate gaps that this history has left behind. The common understanding within architectural history has been that the prison, as a legible architectural type built for a specific penal sanction, emerged at the turn of the 19th century out of heterogeneous practices of medieval detention. And in this standard account of the so-called birth of the prison typology, this history encompasses a relatively short time period, often signposted at the start by George Dance's reconstruction of Newgate Jail from 1780, and at the end by the construction of England's first national penitentiary at Pentonville, which was completed in 1842. So Dance's building signaled that the prison building constituted a specific type that could be designed and that required a specific visual language. So note here the rusticated facade, blind edicules, explicitly symbolic ornament of capture, and so on. Dance's building brought the prison building definitively into the purview of professional architects. So if Dance's building, oops. How do I go back? I had press hard. Sorry about that. Okay. If Dance's building signaled that the prison was a designable typology, Joshua Jebb's Pentonville was a full realization of the modern penitentiary's type as we know it today. Radial plans, I'm missing a slide, but that's okay. Radial plans, double-loaded corridors, and so on. And of course, like any distinct developments in architectural typology, this did not happen in a vacuum. As many legal historians have noted, these same years saw important changes in what were considered normative and proper legal punishments. Replacing fines, corporeal punishment, including capital punishment, and transportation to overseas colonies, the legal sanction of imprisonment in designated buildings for a fixed term, or in other words, the prison sentence, became the norm across much of the Western world. By the middle of the 19th century, in some, the prison sentence had become the predominant form of legal sanction, and the new architectural standards for the design and construction of corresponding buildings had been put into place. that these changes in penal law coincided with a notable reconfiguration of the architectural form of the prison building itself is not accidental. Indeed, the prison building was understood as a necessary corollary to the legal ideas themselves. Today, we tend to associate the prison building with the abstract legal idea of the legal sanction or legal punishment, although as we'll see today, there are many other ways that imprisonment has been used. So this story, as I've briefly rehearsed it here, of the invention of the modern prison, was shaped in large part by an influential body of scholarship that in the late 1970s and early 1980s articulated the connections between prison buildings and the power structures that they implied. These ideas were most directly developed, of course, by the French sociologist Michel Foucault and by the English architectural historian Robin Evans, whose work encompassed a slightly broader study of the prison projects of this period. Evans, in particular, has played an outsized role in how architectural historians understand the prison. For him, the specific expertise of the professional architect allowed the prison building to become widely recognizable as this distinct type, and as you can see in these plans. Through architectural drawings that these professionals produced, the prison's objective and legible form was broadly disseminated to a lay audience. The geometric arrangement of prisoner cells, workrooms, corridors, washrooms, chapels, and inspectors' quarters in plan produced a common discourse regarding the prison building that could be easily translated to legal ideology, the rational, proportionable, non-arbitrary punishment of the prison sentence. So to some extent, these early 19th century developments in penal law occurred with a genuine interest in promoting social good. But when the many failures of the modern prison system became apparent, and this happened really quickly, the year after Pentonville opened, the open scandal of what we would now recognize as a mental health crisis caused by the penitentiary's imposition of solitary confinement was widely publicized, architects distanced themselves from the project altogether. So the brevity of this history, which really encompasses only about 70 years, might seem odd to many people in this room. After all, to imprison is an old idea, and of course it is. Part of the difficulty in contending with this topic is addressing the ways in which these dominant narratives in prison history have excluded these many other ways that the space of incarceration has profoundly shaped political and social relations. And to just give a few really important examples, since at least the 16th century, there have been jails or bridewells or workhouses, among other ways that they've been called, to hold debtors, and were increasingly used to police the urban poor, as Joanna Eines and Peter Leinbaum, among others, have noted. But perhaps the most egregious omission from the Foucault-Evans narrative was the unacknowledgement of the kidnapping and enslavement of millions of people over the centuries in which the transatlantic slave trade shaped the modern world. The racialization of slavery was profoundly shaped by the spaces that these practices necessitated, as Alexander Wahalia, Simone Brown, and others have forcefully claimed. As this work makes clear, the use of carceral space to enforce class and racial boundaries was already well established when Bentham was sketching out his plans for the Panopticon, in other words. These people held captive across those centuries were also held in buildings that were designed, built, and maintained with intention. And today, still this continues. In the United States alone, an estimated 1.9 million people are held captive in some form. As we will see today, these systems continue to disproportionately affect poor and non-white communities. So why linger on this narrative that centers the work of a few 19th century projects at all? Most crucially, this period developed an ideology, a legal ideology, that continues to be projected onto prison buildings. And it goes something like this, that prisons are neutral, non-arbitrary spaces for the allocation of a fair punishment. But an easy translation between the prison building and this idea of a fair legal punishment was and remains a fiction crafted in part by the geometric regularity of these penitentiaries' plans. And a continued faith in these abstract fictions has important ramifications. For one, it allows for ostensibly race-blind laws to perpetuate racist legal practices. Supposedly neutral spaces are still used to police Black and brown communities across the United States today. Thinking about legal punishment abstractly also allows the courts to substantially discount the disparate physical conditions of carceral institutions. Today we see continued evidence of the court's impulses to render punishment abstract, as articulated in statements like this one from Justice Thomas's Helling versus McKinney 1993 dissenting opinion, when he wrote, "Judges or juries, but not jailers, impose punishment." And this is a really remarkable statement that basically says punishment doesn't actually happen in the physical spaces that they are being prescribed. So one of our aims today is to explicitly bring attention to these spaces that have underlined these practices within the realm of design discourse.
Oh, there's another one.
Oh.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa, for providing this historical framing. With this in mind, it is important to also contextualize narratives of carceral landscapes within contemporary frameworks. Today, there are many ongoing discussions and criticisms of the carceral system, especially within the context of the United States and its state of mass incarceration, a system that disproportionately affects BIPOC communities across the nation. Criminal justice and wider community advocates have demonstrated the deep harm these systems have unfurled within system-impacted communities, in degenerating family health and causing significant traumas and often irreparable harm in the lives of those who themselves have been incarcerated. In light of the ongoing studies of human rights infringements within America's prisons and jails, there's been a call to action to close many of the worst offending institutions in lieu of something more just. For example, plans are underway to close two of the nation's worst jails, Rikers Island in New York City and Men's Central Jail in Los Angeles, California. Both facilities have high incidence of violent crimes within their walls and demonstrate an over-reliance of use of solitary confinement. Both environments dehumanize their incarcerated residents, many of whom are simply awaiting trial and have not yet been convicted for a crime. Outside of calls to shutter facilities due to human rights abuses, there are many that leverage the economic benefits to reduce institutionalization, as these facilities are incredibly resource-intensive with poor outcomes. Further, there have been calls to drastically reform the juvenile justice system, recognizing the irreparable harm that the detention has on young minds. Beyond the economic proposition regarding the outsized expense of juvenile detention, justice advocates call for at-home solutions and smaller facilities with less of an emphasis on the crimes committed, instead looking to how new systems can address the underlying conditions that propel youth to crime in the first place. Lastly, in the wake of books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, TV and film like When They See Us, focusing on the injustices faced by the Central Park Five, and the surge of Black Lives Matter protests, there have been national attention drawn to carceral landscapes. Discussions and critiques of mass incarceration have entered the public discourse, and there's increased scrutiny on the use of prisons and jails as a form of retribution instead of other, more rehabilitative alternatives. We are building on the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore to call attention to a broader spatial praxis of the criminal legal system. This includes, but not only the facilities themselves, but the landscapes they are inextricably tied to. Through our shared interest in carceral landscapes, Lisa and I organized today's event to bridge gaps in the design and planning fields and insert outlying perspectives that are too often siloed in the conversations of how to move forward while contextualizing both the past and present. We leveraged Lisa's background as a historian who has deeply engaged archival research as both architecture and law, and mine as an architect and urban planner, injecting advocacy as a method of design practice to paint a more complete picture of carceral landscapes here at the Graduate School of Design. This event is a first of its kind here at the GSD, and we look forward to hear more from our speakers, our three speakers, who will be talking about their work across a variety of scales and sectors on the impacts of carceral landscapes, scaling both past and present. Before we begin, I do want to just do a little bit of level setting. It's important for us to review a few terms that you may hear throughout the day. Please note that these terms are not, they have larger definitions, so these are not the end-all be-all, but we hope that they help to significantly frame your, your feedback and your conversations today. So the first one, incarceration. It's a catch-all phrase referring to the statement of imprisonment, confinement, and enclosure. A prison. A public building or other place of confinement of persons, whether as a punishment imposed by the law or otherwise in the course of the administration of justice. A state or federal correctional institution for incarceration of felony offenders for terms of 1 year or more. In American criminal law, prisons serve as facilities used for the implementation of a legal sanction. A jail, not to be confused with a prison, which is a building designated by law or regularly used for the confinement of persons held in lawful custody. A place of confinement that is more than a police station lockup, but less than a prison. Jails most commonly serve as an intermediary space where people are held after they have been arrested for a crime, but before they have received a sentence, or where someone who is sentenced for a short-term time. Deterrence, the use of punishment to thwart people from offending. Recidivism, an individual's relapse into criminal behavior. In 2016, the Department of Justice conducted a study on recidivism and found that across the United States, 78% of people recidivize within 5 years and 83% within 9. Decarceration, the process of reducing prisons and jail populations. Abolition, advocacy to reduce or eliminate the criminal justice system and replace them with systems of rehabilitation, ceasing a focus on punishment and institutionalization. Diversion, a system or series of services used to offer an alternative to arrest and incarceration. Diversion programs turn to underlying causes of criminal behaviors such as houselessness, job insecurity, unmet mental and physical health needs, and low educational attainment. Diversion programs reduce crime, and it is a cost-effective alternative to incarceration. And lastly, restorative justice, which is an indigenous practice that promotes the rehabilitation of individuals through the reconciliation with their victims and their broader community. Restorative justice is experiencing an increased usage, and specifically in a response towards juvenile as well as nonviolent offenders. Today, we are joined by 3 esteemed guests who will speak to their respective work on carceral landscapes, which will be followed by a roundtable discussion. It is our hope that it becomes a lively conversation, which we invite you all to participate in. Sarah Lopez is an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Stuart Weitzman School of Design. She is a built environment historian of 20th century Mexico and the United States, whose research focuses on material histories on migration, remittance development, and landscapes, and migrant incarceration. Professor Lopez is interested in experimental historical methods, ordinary landscapes, and environmental humanities. Lopez's book, The Remittance Landscape, The Space of Migration in Rural Mexico and the Urban United States, or USA, won the 2017 Spiro Kostoff Book Award for the Society of Architectural Historians. Melanie Newport is an associate professor of history at the University of Connecticut. She teaches at the Hartford campus. Professor Newport is author of the book, This Is My Jail, Local Politics and the Rise of Mass Incarceration, out now with the University of Pennsylvania Press. As a sweeping history of Cook County Jail in Chicago, This Is My Jail foregrounds the role of jailed people in contesting and constraining mass incarceration. This Is My Jail won the Sharon Harris Book Award from the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute. As an interdisciplinary scholar of recent American politics and carcerality, her most recent research on disaster incarceration in the 20th and 21st century builds on her interest in the liminal spaces of the carceral state. Her research has been supported by the University of Connecticut Humanities Institute, University of Illinois at Chicago Libraries, Black Metropolis Research Consortium, the University of Chicago, and the Center for the Humanities at Temple. Professor Newport is a series editor with the Chicago Visions and Revisions series at the University of Chicago Press, where she acquires Chicago-related trade books in criminal justice, sociology, and history. She holds a PhD from Temple University. Last but not least, we have Andrew Manuel Crespo, who is the Morris Wasserstein Public Interest Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School, a founding editor of Inquest, and the executive faculty director of the Institute to End Mass Incarceration. A national expert on criminal law and policy, his scholarship and public writings examine how the power structures and legal frameworks of the American penal system combine to produce the systems of carceral harm and oppression known as mass incarceration. Prior to joining the Legal Academy, Professor Crespo served as a trial attorney with the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, where he represented over 100 clients facing criminal charges. Before that, he worked for 3 years as a law clerk, including 2 years at the U.S. Supreme Court, where he clerked for Justice Stephen Breyer and Elena Kagan. As a student at the Harvard Law School in 2007, Professor Crespo was the first Latino elected to serve as president of the Harvard Law Review. He returned to Harvard as a professor in 2015, and in 2019 became the first Latino promoted to a tenured position on the law school faculty. And lastly, I would like to introduce our very own Ana Maria Leon Crespo, no relation, who will lead today's discussion following the presentations. Professor Leon's work traces how spatial practices and transnational networks of power and resistance shape the modernity and coloniality of the Americas. Her research and teaching foregrounds the agency of populations under struggles and the multiple forms of bias embedded in the built environment and its histories. She's invested in the collaborative approaches to learning, teaching, and writing, attention to multiple critical positions, particularly those of historically underrepresented groups. She argues grounds our understanding of history in the politics of co-liberation. Please join me and Lisa in welcoming our speakers.
Thanks, Sarah. Are you guys getting excited? I'm getting excited. I'm excited to think with you today. Oh, you're fine. I want to start with this image that I got off of eBay, which is my favorite off-the-beaten-path archive for telling the visual story of jailing in Chicago. It shows a wall between the Cook County Jail and the Chicago House of Correction. The wall was the original boundary of the House of Correction. In the 1920s, the city of Chicago sold a piece of their land to the county so that they could move the downtown jail 5 miles kind of to the edge of the city because nobody wanted a jail or the people who came to visit it or the people who were leaving it next to the city's shops and hotels, especially in the wake of the riot in 1919, when people both inside and outside the jail had been in kind of open racial combat. The House of Correction had an extensive brick-making operation that had begun with a quarry on the jail site in the 1880s. By 1921, prisoners were making 2.3 million bricks a year. Prisoners laid bricks made of clay from the jail yard to establish the first sidewalks, linking the jail to the surrounding neighborhood, today known as Little Village. The city used jail bricks for its sewers. Prisoners used the bricks to construct a new wall around the jail, and additional cell houses and work buildings at the House of Correction site. So jailed people transformed the earth into bricks, and the bricks were used to wall them in. The wall falling down in 1953 was a mundane event, but it made the news, and this is a news image, because people cared about what was going on at the jail. The image would portend the merger of the two jails in the late 1960s, negating the need for the wall between them, as well as the adoption of more durable materials like concrete, as jails embraced urban renewal, which was an important justification for jail expansion and modernization at mid-century. So it's easy to think of the narrative of mass incarceration as starting in the 1970s, but by that time, jailing had already been going on for almost 150 years in Chicago. The gradual escalation of mass incarceration happened brick by brick. And for Black people, this was especially true. Around the time that the wall fell down in 1953, the population at the House of Correction was 72% Black. At Cook County Jail, it was 52% Black. So there was always a racialized incarceration happening in Chicago at a pretty phenomenal scale. By the end of the 1960s, again, before many people will say mass incarceration starts, the merged jail had a population that was 90% Black. Today, the population is about 75% Black and 15% Latino and about 10% white. These numbers can feel solid and inevitable, right? The mass of mass incarceration. But with the wall, I want to kind of use this as a chance to think about the carceral landscape as mutable, and maybe even so fragile that it could be knocked down by wind. So I want to take you on kind of a trans-historical walking tour of Cook County Jail, which I should know in contrast to Sarah's institution, this is a public institution, a county institution that's in Chicago, but run by Cook County, the Cook County Sheriff. I want to use this walking tour to kind of think about how we move beyond the ideas of jails as kind of permanently walled off from the city to think about their fragility and their porousness. I'm fascinated by how artist Maria Gaspar, who you should all be following on Instagram, she's amazing, how she brings the Cook County Jail wall to you. So you can puzzle over it. Think about which side of the wall you're on. Take an interest in the jail. Think about what its power means for you. And as we talk about the evolving functions of jails over time, I'm interested in, you know, the classic definition, right? These are sites of punishment for petty crimes. These are places of detention for people awaiting trial. But what I'm trying to do is think about jails as spaces where mass incarceration was made, but also contested and constrained. So how do people use these spaces politically? I want to think about what it meant to be within the walls and how policymakers made the walls more effective at containing prisoner politics over time. I want to think about the quality story of mass incarceration in Chicago as much as the quantity story. In the 1950s, jailed people maintained a degree of public visibility. There was a relatively free movement within the jail as people used jail newspapers to communicate with each other. They documented their concerns and priorities. They made demands of administrators, things like, if you would just give us some paint, we have the time, we're willing, we would like to be in nicer spaces. I don't want to give the impression at all that this political visibility meant that the jail was nice. It was filthy. Bed bugs were constant. Children were not allowed to visit. Staff were castigated for having things like brass knuckles. But to mitigate prisoner uprisings, jailed people were being given something to do. And they used that capacity to try and improve their conditions. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, jailed people appeared on television talking about how the jail endangered them and impacted their lives. Even within the walls, it was a space that was permeable. For example, we see here in the image on the right, a journalist speaking to jailed people during an uprising in 1954. They're in an 1880s gallery style jail dormitory. There were 3 of these at the House of Correction. These were people who were largely there because they owed city fees for breaking kind of city regulations. They weren't even serious enough to be misdemeanors. Well, the gallery-style building had kind of a wall-less quality inside, right? It's mostly just about being able to see into the bars. Jailed people knew what was going on with each other in this space, right? So while this looks very secure, there's not a lot of privacy. For example, in 1967, when a guard recruited a group of jailed people to assist him in the deadly beating of prisoner Anton Novotny, jailed people throughout the galleries heard his cries. They saw him struggling as he was dragged up the stairs. They heard his head hitting the stairs. And while we often talk about the kind of panopticon quality of such spaces, right, ensuring continuous surveillance from the outside, we have to also think about this, again, as a site of awareness where jailed people knew what was going on and they could advocate for each other. And part of how we know what happened to Anton Novotny is because the people who heard and witnessed his death were able to testify at trial. Jails were also permeable in terms of information coming in and out. For example, and this was really critical to movement building within the 1960s in particular. This space is a day room in the 1929 kind of main building of Cook County Jail. The jail was originally designed for solitary confinement, so the cells were very small. They had bars, much like this one, and jailed people would spend most of their time in the day room together. The cells were almost immediately used for double and triple celling. It was regarded as the jail without bars, and so the windows were covered with these slats. So we'll see kind of in a later slide a similar usage before. So it's a very dark space. You can also see they're sitting on benches. The wooden benches were often used as projectiles during uprisings, or to even defend against guards trying to retake the space. So in what ways are these spaces kind of permeable politically in the 1960s? For example, when comedian Dick Gregory was jailed for protesting school segregation outside the home of Mayor Richard Daley in 1963, he moved his protest into the Chicago House of Correction. And he really was there as a collaborator with jailed people. They were ready for him to come. They had seen what was happening on the news and in the newspapers. So Gregory ends up being a really important spokesman for them. For example, publicizing their concerns about the racist administrators of the jail, and drawing attention to jailed people's ability to call a hunger strike at a moment's notice. So we get these windows into the politics of jailed people, even as they're in these spaces that seem walled off. Another example, when Cha-Cha Jimenez, leader of the Young Lords gang, was incarcerated in the North Cell House of the House of Correction in 1968, again, one of these gallery-style buildings. He faced abuse from guards. He formed connections with both ordinary and politicized prisoners. And the jail librarian, a Muslim prisoner, offered him books like the autobiography of Malcolm X from the jail library. And it changed the course of his life. Cha-Cha Jimenez emerged from the jail eager to transform the Young Lords into a radical Puerto Rican political organization modeled after the Black Panther Party. So these are not just punishing spaces. I don't want to give you the impression that like jail was like somehow good for them, but people are in these spaces trying to find ways to survive, trying to kind of cling to their humanity and maximize it as well as they can. The murder of Illinois Black Panther Party chair Fred Hampton and Mark Clark at the hands of police in December 1969 also had its origins in the jail. The informant, William O'Neill, had been cultivated as an FBI source while he was in Cook County Jail. In the wake of the killing, 3 of the survivors of the raids on Hampton's apartment were jailed on charges of attempted murder, aggravated battery, and unlawful use of weapons in an effort to try and destroy their credibility. And while we often remember Fred Hampton for saying, you can jail a revolutionary, but you can't jail the revolutionary, we see in this story that jailers were surely willing to try. So all of this is happening before jailed people had formal recognition of their constitutional rights to be not only free of cruel and unusual punishment like other prisoners, but to have protection of their presumption of innocence and their right to due process, meaning right that they couldn't be punished before trial. At Cook County Jail, which becomes the kind of common identifier for the Cook County Department of Corrections, which is again this merged city and county jail, it took about 15 years for the federal courts to iron out what exactly those constitutional rights meant, and these had serious implications for the jail. In the intervening period, though, in the 1970s, And again, I appreciated Sarah mentioning federal architectural guidelines. If you go on ncjrs.gov, you can search the abstracts database of their library, and you can find like manuals of like thousands and thousands of pages of federal architectural recommendations for jails, for example, from the 1970s, that even though, right, the idea of kind of constitutional rights was not necessarily worked out for jailed people in this moment, the federal government was creating new standards for jails because these places were so, you know, broken down 19th century buildings were pretty common for jails. And this is important because in the 1970s is like the moment for jail construction. By 1980, something like 75% of jails have been built in the last like 10 or 15 years. Okay. So bringing you back to these 1970s buildings, there are not a lot of good photos of them, so I had to use these pictures from the Chicago in the Year 2000 collection, which is an amazing document of the jail at a particular moment in many of the buildings, but they're not labeled, so you kind of have to know where you're looking at. But again, we see the kind of the jail without bars type windows. About 2,500 beds were added to the jail across 5 new buildings, divisions 3 through 8. And they were connected by a series of underground tunnels. And the tunnels were intended to ensure easy movement between the jail buildings and the county courthouse during Chicago's cold winters. But they were important logistically to the 1970s jail expansion on both a kind of metaphorical and practical level, as they're part really of the disappearing of jailed people from both kind of public and political visibility. And this is especially true, right, as tough on crime politics really work to demonize people who are in jail. One of these buildings was the first women's jail in Chicago. The HVAC never worked right. It got so hot that the women would break out the windows in the dead of winter. Many of the windows were very deep brown tint or these kind of slats, so you couldn't really see the daylight. And in a poem that I have spent a lot of time thinking about by a woman incarcerated in the jail in the 1970s named Carolyn X, she recounts the experience of being jailed. Wake up in the middle of the night in a cold panic just because you cannot hear your baby breathing. Then you remember, jail. And she really creates this kind of sense of banishment and confinement, right, being apart from your family. And I think in this poem, right, jail, like you just feel the walls closing in, and you can kind of see how that feeling would be replicated in these spaces. In the 1980s, we see the kind of culmination of the prisoner rights suit Duran v. Elrod, which put an actual population cap in place at Cook County Jail. So saying, finally, you can't have people sleeping on the floor, you can't have 3 or 4 people sharing a cell. There is a set number of people that you can have in the jail. And the sheriff is actually enlisted to just let people out. He's going through just like stacks of files and being like, well, I guess we'll let this guy out. And the judges are freaking out because like, how could you just be letting people out of jail? But that was the thing, right? You could just let anybody out. And so one of the ways that the county responds to this, because this is so politically unpopular, is through jail construction. So we have to think about, right, the entire history of jailing in Cook County up to 1981 is just constrained by the number of buildings they had, the number of beds. They had never been willing to think about, like, how do we really get serious about accommodating everyone we want to jail? So here we see a kind of a counterfactual story about mass incarceration over time, over the late 80s, as they're building maximum security jail buildings on the site. Right, this number of people in jail is kind of going up and down, but still staying right where the cap was, kind of maxed up at 6,000, and eventually with the opening of a new building, reaching up to 8,000. But the dashed line shows us a kind of counterfactual story, right? If they had had the buildings that they wished that they had to do as much jailing as the courts wished that they could do, they would have had, right, 9,000 people in jail, right? And so then the capacity to jail thousands and thousands and thousands more people a year. This represents a shift toward what gets talked about as preventative detention. And so the buildings that are built in the 1980s and 1990s were really maximum security buildings that worked to reinforce the idea that people in jail were there because they had committed crimes, that they were guilty of crimes, even though these are people awaiting trial. And these structures are really intended to isolate them from each other. So an increased use of, for example, pod-style architecture to create kind of micro jails that could be sealed off from each other, from other parts of the jail, very restricted movement. Right, and as Sarah was saying, right, these look like extremely fixed places. Right, they are very solid looking. They were in such a rush to build Division 9 that it's built almost like a parking garage with kind of prefab materials. And it's hard to look at these buildings and be like, wow, if it wasn't for the population cap, mass incarceration actually would have been much more intense, right? And this is a jail that was incarcerating over 100,000 people a year. So buildings proved to be a constraint to mass incarceration. They were big, they were expensive, they were slow to build. They were not always that good at keeping jailed people in. In the early 80s, for example, jailed people hijacked a bus and just drove through the gates. Dozens of people escaped during the 1970s. Regardless of what kind of buildings jailed people were in, they were still finding each other and imagining freedom together within the walls. So even though in the 1990s we're seeing, this is Division 11, the kind of white exterior jail building, right, we're reviving the panopticon. This time it's kind of filled with computers that are looking into the different pods. And just to note, like, Rula Architects gets kind of celebrated in Glamour magazine at this time in 1996 as like a woman architect, as like the ultra girl power kind of flex, building a prison. So we see kind of some warped cultural things happening here too. But jailed people, again, are finding each other in these spaces that are still, you know, despite all of this, adding nearly 5,000 jail beds in by the 1990s, getting to a capacity of almost 11,000. This is a map of not quite the current jail site. The kind of red building on the left is the 1929 building that's been torn down. This is from a great student project at the Art Institute of Chicago, this is like really the best map of the jail that I've ever seen. So please be thinking about like how you can use your skills to help people, because like I immediately sent this map to a journalist because they kept reporting the jail buildings incorrectly, because there isn't this kind of resource coming from the institution itself. But within this kind of vast complex, the segmentation of jailed people from each other through these kind of more pod-style designs. Right, the culminating effort to isolate jailed people from each other politically for the purposes of security kind of happens through individual jailing at home with the creation of electronic monitoring. And these are people, again, if we think about the tunnels kind of disappearing jailed people from public view, electronic monitoring or the use of an electronic shackle to monitor somebody in their home to make sure they don't leave through house arrest means that people have had an increasingly difficult time advocating for themselves still as prisoners, right? There's not the same degree of possibility for accountability that could be formed in a jail setting when, again, people are cultivating an awareness of each other. So I think we need to think about these ways that dispersing jailed people into individual homes, recruiting their family members as jailers, particularly as Sheriff Tom Dart has repeatedly blocked appeals for people to have movement to places like laundry rooms in their apartment buildings. Right, thinking about kind of what does it look like to think about carceral landscapes as this net of carceral responsibility is widening and the possibility for political and legal accountability are narrowing. So just to kind of think about Cook County Jail today, again, as a politically closed space. This image is from Chicago Magazine. In 2020, you can see that they have painted the space. I think this is Division 9 or 10. It's much better lit than you would see in early periods. Right, they've allowed a photographer in to take these kind of beautiful artistic photos that show the kind of distribution of resources to segregated prisoners to try and stop COVID spread. This was part of the sheriff's response to a lawsuit that said he wasn't, giving people masks, that was part of a kind of a larger activist data collection project that had shown that Cook County Jail was one of the major sites of COVID spread, not just for Chicago, but for the state of Illinois. But this is part of a kind of a over a decade long effort by the Cook County Sheriff to control the narrative about what is happening in the jail, right? To reduce the story of the jail to, right, just a bunch of doors. And the press has been willing to help him out in this project. So when we think about, right, how do we move between these walls, right, we have to take our cues from jailed people who, for example, right, used the windows of the jail in 2020 to communicate with people who were protesting on their behalf out in the street. Jailed people continue to find new ways of challenging efforts to isolate them and to erase their concerns. So I hope that we can try to see through the walls, that we take the walls as a challenge, again, to think about the permeability of the jail, the idea that the jail is knowable, and that when jailed people tell us about jail conditions, that we'll be listening. And I want to kind of bring the story of the crumbling wall full circle. When I returned to the jail in 2021 for one of my walking tours, I saw a segment of the wall had been removed as they were tearing down Division 1, a building that was basically said to be obsolete from the time it was built, originally kind of solitary confinement design. For the 80 years, people had said that this building was a terrible place and a dehumanizing place, but it was finally removed. And so again, right, these walls are not fixed, these spaces are not permanent, and we can imagine a world without them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Dana, for putting this together and for inviting me to be a part of it and for inviting the Institute to End Mass Incarceration to co-sponsor this with you. And thank you to all of you for being here. This is such a stimulating and, I think, necessary conversation to be starting, to be joining, to be continuing, to be expanding. As Dana said earlier on, my name is Andrew Crespo. I teach just a couple blocks from here at the law school. I teach criminal law and criminal procedure, and about 2 years ago started a center there called the Institute to End Mass Incarceration, which I co-run with my co-director and partner in that work, Premal Daria. And it's just such I think, a great opportunity to be here, walking the couple of blocks. I've been at Harvard for a long time, and sometimes just a couple of blocks can feel like a tremendous distance. There's not a ton of times that I've gotten to come over to the grad school, and the grad school of design. And when Lisa and Dana reached out, it was actually this terrific connection, because I told them, gosh, I'd been wanting to reach out to you about this very set of topics and about the role of carceral infrastructure in mass incarceration. So this feels just totally kismet, and I'm just delighted to be here with you. I've got 3 sort of main goals for this presentation. The first is I'm hoping to just sort of step back a bit and talk about this phrase and this phenomenon, mass incarceration. Talk about what we mean by those words and the multiple layered meanings that mass incarceration in America can have. Second, I want to talk about what ending mass incarceration looks like and requires, and give you a sense of the theory of change and the work that this institute is designed to do and that we are doing. And finally, I want to talk about one specific sort of a major component of that work, which is our carceral infrastructure project, which ties directly into a lot of the themes we've been talking about so far today. So let me start by talking about this just tremendous phenomenon, this tremendous injustice, and this problem that confronts our society, mass incarceration. This is a phrase that I am confident everyone in this room has heard. You've heard it even just in the past hour. But it is a phrase that carries many different meanings inside it. People use it to mean different things. And unpacking what it means is, I think, really important as a way to frame the whole conversation. At least when I use this word, and when we use this word at our institute, we're talking about 3 interrelated ideas. The first is understanding mass incarceration as a system of unprecedented scale. The United States incarcerates more of its own people than any country in the history of the world. There has never been a system of human incarceration that operates anywhere near the size of the one that exists in the country where we live today. The United States has about 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. You can compare this to other countries in the world in terms of, these are per capita rates. So in other words, these are controlled for the population size of the country. The United States is, to call it an outlier is to almost understate the difference in kind and scale between the amount of incarceration in our country and other countries, especially when you look at the sort of the, euphemistically at least, peer countries, countries with similar economic, socioeconomic conditions, resources. We are clearly doing something very, very different from the rest of the world. There was a point in time recently, our prison population has started to dip since 2009, but within the past decade, there was a point in time where the United States was incarcerating more people in absolute numbers, not per capita numbers, absolute numbers, than China and India combined. Okay? China and India, the 2 most populous countries in the world. Their populations massively dwarfing ours. We had more people in absolute numbers in prison than both of those countries together. This is something that has happened within the lifetime of many of the people in this room. The prison population, as you sort of heard referenced earlier, basically starts to climb in 1973. It goes nearly vertical through the 1980s, continues climbing through the 1990s, hits its peak in 2009, and then has been sort of drifting downward since then. I say drifting to give you a sense of what it would look like for this to sort of ever return even close to the starting point of the 1970s. This is a projection of, if we just try to extrapolate out, what the decline in prison would look like over time, it would take to 2091 to get to about half of where it is now, which would still be massively higher than where it was in the 1970s and would still be a major outlier globally. Predictions are that, if we tried to draw this out, it would take a century and a quarter or a century and a half to return even just to the 1972 levels. Nor is mass incarceration, if we just use the word incarceration, enough to capture the full extent of the system of carceral control that we have in the country. Let me just explain for you what these lines are. The dark blue that you're seeing is our jail population. You've heard Melanie talking about jails and the difference between jails and prisons. The light blue is the prison population. So when I am showing you this figure here, all of that green, the incarcerated population in the penal system, is covered by these first two colors. On top of that, you have parole and probation, which are systems of carceral supervision out in the community. Those dwarf the incarcerated population. So if you put together all of this, you can see the massive number of people under state supervision, state penal system supervision, millions of people every day in the United States. When we think about this in terms of scale, we can think of the scale of the impact. When you incarcerate and control that many people, that many of your own citizens, your own neighbors, that has rippling effects out through the rest of the country. Today, on any given day, there are about 1.9 million people incarcerated in the American penal system. Of course, there's tremendous turnover. In a given year, there are somewhere between 10 and 11 million people who enter a jail or prison. So you can think of this as both a massive system that is having massive churn. People are coming in and out of it all the time, and then are exiting this as formerly incarcerated folks. There are 4.9 million formerly incarcerated people who had been in state or federal prison, 20 million who have ever been convicted of a felony and as a result are carrying some of the lifelong consequences of a criminal record and of contact with the penal system. 79 million more who have a criminal record. So this is the jump from felonies to misdemeanors. And then we can think about what that means for people connected to people who have all of those records. 113 million adults have an immediate family member who has ever been to prison or jail. Note the word adults. When we include children, and when we think about this expanded to include really intimate family relationships like grandparents, uncles, there are estimates that upwards of 50% of the people in this country are directly impacted by incarceration, either themselves or through that one degree of connection to someone who is deeply important in their life, a loved one. That is a scale that is something we should just pause and sit with and try to grapple the enormity of. Half the country. When most folks use the word mass incarceration, that's the first thing that comes to mind. It is indeed massive. But that's only the first important way of understanding the word. The second important way of understanding the word mass incarceration is to understand that it is a system defined by race, place, and class. For that reason, there's a famous sociologist named Louis Quant who says we should not use the word mass incarceration. He says the stupendous expansion and intensification of the activities of the American police, criminal courts, and prison over the past 30 years have been finely targeted, first by class, second by race, and third by place, leading not to mass incarceration, but to the hyper-incarceration of sub-proletarian African-American men from the imploding ghetto. The important insight here is the idea that when you say that something is a mass phenomenon in your society, it suggests that it is something broadly felt in your society. Right? Think about this as like a society that has gone through and continues to feel the effects of a global pandemic, a massive event. There's not a person in the room, in the country, in the city, there's not a person in the world who was not touched by that phenomenon. It was massive. We can say that half the country has been affected by mass incarceration and at the same time recognize that there are many people in the country for whom this is a abstract, distant, remote, almost theoretical type of problem as opposed to one directly felt. How can both of those things be true at the same time? They can be true because of this. Because not only is it massive in scale, it is even more massive when you think that it is resting on and impacting very, very targeted focused communities. Let's talk about these filters, this sort of triple filter that Louis Quant is laying out. First, in terms of race. Almost 2/3 of young people in prison are Black or Hispanic. If you think of the population of the United States, a little bit more than a quarter Black and Hispanic, if you take those as the broad demographics of the entire country. More than half of the incarcerated population, Black and Hispanic. The impacts get even more intense when we talk about socioeconomic strata. This figure is showing you 3 income brackets, and I want to just start by noting that the highest one here is starting at $37,000 of income per year, all right? Not exactly a high number. That's capturing from $37,500 a year of income all the way up to, you know, endless money. Down here we have income below $22,500. The non-incarcerated population is just the exact flip of the incarcerated population, right? The majority of people in prison had been making, prior to their incarceration, less than $22,500 a year. This is a system that is incarcerating overwhelmingly people who are very, very poor and people of color, coming from very specific places. This is a map of New York City. This is capturing a phenomenon that was initially reported by sort of incarcerated scholars, by men who were locked up in the New York penal system, and observed that even though they were sent to prisons all over the state, they were encountering people who were neighbors, saying, "Wait, how are we all here?" And they conducted their first study, a sort of survey of these neighborhoods of where they were coming from, which was later then replicated by scholars on the outside. Their initial reports show that something like upwards of 70% of the entire incarcerated population in the state of New York came from 7 neighborhoods in New York City. This is the sort of focal point in hyper-incarceration what Quant's talking about. We've heard a lot today about Chicago. There's a project called the $1 Million Blocks Project, mapping incarceration in Chicago, that's similarly trying to show the neighborhoods and, in fact, the actual blocks, the city blocks within the city that are sending the vast majority of people into prison. Putting these 3 things together, we get the race, class, and place sort of focal point of mass incarceration that's essential to understanding how it operates. But the third key way, and important way to understand mass incarceration, is to understand it as not an accident. This is not something that we fell into, that we found as a consequence of or as an unintended consequence of other policies. It is a current day instantiation of a long history. You heard reference earlier to Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, one of the most famous and widely read critiques of mass incarceration of the past 2 decades. She says mass incarceration is a massive system of racial and social control. On the first of these, a system of racial control, I'm reminded of words that one of my colleagues at the law school wrote in his book, Race, Crime, and the Law, that connects to history. He says, in many places, for several generations, it was a crime for Blacks to learn to read, to flee enslavement, or to defend themselves, their families, or their friends from physical abuse. It was a crime in some for Blacks to do all sorts of things deemed to be permissible or admirable when done by others. Kennedy, of course, is talking about the institution of slavery, in which criminal law made it illegal for Black people to do basic human things like read, be free in their community, defend themselves when they were attacked, defend their families. Criminal law, in other words, was central to the institution of slavery itself by defining free life as a crime for an enslaved person. We think often of that ending with the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. If you were to ask someone who had taken, say, I don't know, 5th grade history or 8th grade history, what's the 13th Amendment to the United States? They would say that's the one that ended slavery. That's the one that said, you can't have slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Except that is not what the 13th Amendment says. The 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. In other words, you can read the 13th Amendment as legalizing slavery so long as it is attached to a criminal conviction. Slavery is prohibited except as punishment for crime when that punishment is done through the court system and the penal system. That exception clause in the 13th Amendment was quickly seized upon in the sort of revanchist attempt, especially in the South, to reclaim the status quo of racial hierarchy and power that existed before the Civil War. David Blackman has written a tremendous book in history about this called Slavery by Another Name. He observes that beginning in the late 1860s, so after the Civil War, and accelerating after the return of white political control in 1877 with the end of Reconstruction, every Southern state enacted an array of interlocking laws essentially intended to criminalize black life. Southern prisons turned black overnight. This is data from Blackman's book. By 1871, prisons in Virginia that had scarcely admitted a black person before the Civil War, because of course before the Civil War, most black people in the South were not in prisons, but rather were enslaved. Prisons in Virginia that had not had black people before 1871 were more than 80% black by 1871. In Georgia, the prison population was nearly 90% black by 1899. This is what creates the possibility for infamous pictures like this one from the Library of Congress to show us in 1903, incarcerated children working the fields, an image that evokes slavery before the Civil War. This is 1903. These images continue on. We see images in 2015 from Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana, where again we see people of color working the fields under the supervision of a mounted, armed foreman, where that foreman is now a correctional officer. Alexander says that mass incarceration is a massive system of racial and social control. The social control piece is important to pick up on also. Our prison system is the backstop for problems that we can directly tie to social structures, social conditions, and social inequality. You can see here that people in state prisons are 3 times more likely to be unemployed, that the homeless population is dramatically higher in state prisons than in the total US population. The basic idea here being that you could imagine any number of social policies and social institutions to deal with structural inequality and systemic inequality. You could imagine massive investments in education. You could imagine massive investments in public health. You could imagine massive investments in humane and people-oriented treatment facilities. We tend to invest in carceral solutions to social problems. And as a result, we see that our prison population reflects all of those social problems addressed through prisons as opposed to, or at least massively dwarfing others. Again, thinking of Cook County Jail that Melanie spoke about. Administrators of the Cook County Jail often say that they run the largest mental health institution in the country. This is what we're talking about. In fact, you connect it to mental health. It's sort of fascinating to think about the evolution of deinstitutionalization and the rise of mass incarceration. This chart is just meant to show you the gray line here is mental hospital inpatients, and there was massive effort to deinstitutionalize, to have a sort of decarceral approach to asylums and mental hospitals. And it was successful. People were, the population detained in mental hospitals plummeted starting in the 1960s. In the 1970s and 1980s, of course, this is the familiar line from before, the prison population is jumping. This line is just adding the two together. and showing that essentially you've got a drop in a rebound that is a transfer from mental institution carcerality to penal institution carcerality, which is, again, just meant to capture, this is a system that is responding to social choices that we make and a way of addressing social phenomena out in the world. It is a mental health system. It is a system that is dealing with the predictable consequences of underinvestment in education, but that is responding to those through bars, incarceration, and prison guards. As a result, you can see disparities all across and linkages all across the penal system to other forms of social inequality and harm. Right? A third of people in prison have had parents who are incarcerated. There's overrepresentation of folks from foster care systems, homelessness, subsidized housing and low income and poverty, educational exclusion, and contact with police. All of this is something that's built into the idea and the phrase mass incarceration. Quoting from law professor Ben Levin here, who says, when we're using the word mass incarceration, when we're thinking in mass terms, we're inviting a more radical or totalizing critique of the current systems and its institutions, and a deeper reckoning with questions of political economy to address the levers of power and the distribution of resources in society. If we understand mass incarceration this way, as a massive system, one that has racial disparate impacts, oppressive consequences, and that is not an accident, that has to inform how we think about what it would mean to end mass incarceration. Because if you understand mass incarceration this way, it influences what your theory of change has to be for how you bring about the end of mass incarceration. If mass incarceration were an unintended consequence, you could imagine ending it just through persuasion. You could just try to find the people who have the votes in legislatures and tell them, hey, you may not realize this, but this is what's happening out in the world, and you can't have wanted that to happen, so let me prepare the white paper for you, the data, the research to kind of just make you aware of the problem so that now you can start putting policies in place that are different. But if your understanding of the system is that it's not accidental, or at least that it's tied to histories that have a purpose behind them, that influences your theory of change, because it means that persuasion alone is probably not enough to change this massive system. That in addition to persuasion, you have to build power among those who are harmed by mass incarceration so that they can force people who have power over them, who may not want to change the policies that we have, to change differently in response to the power being built among the communities that want to change. That theory of change is what really drives the work that we do at the Institute to End Mass Incarceration. We say that our mission is in our name. We're helping to build power within and supporting the leadership of the communities most directly impacted by the penal system. And we aim to end mass incarceration root and branch. Root and branch meaning there are deep causes and deep drivers of mass incarceration that have to be addressed, because if not, and you just trim the branches, you just let it grow back again, sometimes grow back even stronger. I want to talk a bit about what our work is in big pictures, just to give you a sense of the Institute, and then talk about a key component of that, which is our carceral infrastructure. But our work, big picture, turns on this idea of building community power in solidarity with other folks, including those directly impacted, along two key lines. One of those relates to innovation and ideas. The basic idea being that in order to fundamentally have a paradigm shift on a system this massive, you need to have bold imagination. You need to sort of spark conversation and connections between people who have the capacity to think about worlds that don't yet exist, right? The same type of bold imagination that would allow people back in 1850, black people, white people, to imagine a society that treated black people equally to white people. Bold imagination lets you imagine radically basic ideas, right? A radically basic idea is an idea that is both obvious once it's accepted and fundamentally disruptive before it is, right? The idea, say, that black people have equal rights to white people. That is an obvious idea to say today, and prior to slavery was a radically disruptive idea. A radically obvious idea today around mass incarceration might be something like, it shouldn't exist. The United States shouldn't incarcerate more people than any other country in the history of the world. All of these stats that I showed you are wrong and shouldn't happen. That seems like maybe both an obvious idea and also a radical idea, because it would require massive changes to how we currently approach incarceration. To help sort of try to catalyze a community of people who are trying to figure out what it looks like to sort of imagine the particularities of these radically bold ideas, we do a couple things. One is we publish a magazine called Inquest. If you haven't heard of it, I just put it up here so that you can know about it and read it. We publish 2 essays a week. We keep them to about 2,000 words, the goal being to have something that is really accessible and readable. But also, more fundamentally than that, the goal being to bring together a community of thinkers and doers who are deeply engaged in the work of decarceration. In other words, we don't think of this as aiming at an audience of folks who are coming to learn the basics of mass incarceration, but rather a place for folks who are deeply in it to meet people who are deeply in it from entirely different perspectives. So over a span of, say, 3 months, we'll publish folks who are organizing on the inside against conditions in their own prison. We'll publish a public health specialist about sort of epidemiology in prison. We'll publish an elected official. We'll publish a judge. We'll publish lawyers who have represented people, doctors who have worked in prisons. The whole point being to bring everyone together into this one big conversation. And since we're here on campus and many of you are local, I wanted to share another thing that Inquest does is we have these symposia across campus. We had one just a few weeks ago with the Visiting Room Project, which is the largest collection of first-person interviews with men serving life without parole sentences in Angola prison, the picture you saw before. Some of the men who had been serving time in Angola have since been released, and they were here on campus all day, and we screened the film and had this great conversation with them. Next week, we have another of these. Next Thursday, we're going to be screening Beyond Walls, which is an anthology presentation from abolitionist filmmakers. That'll be next Thursday at 6 p.m. And we do these types of screenings throughout the year. Again, the goal being to bring people together and sort of create these spaces for really catalytic brainstorming together. You can subscribe to this easily. You just go to the website. There's a subscribe button right up top, and you'll get one email from us every week. Saturday morning it comes in, and it tells you what the 2 essays were that week. Separate from Inquest, a key part, I should mention also another way that we try to support this brainstorming is we have fellows who are affiliated with the Institute. Brittany White is a formerly incarcerated organizer. Rachel Bedard had worked at Rikers as a physician. And James Banal is formerly incarcerated and a professor at California State University who studies the way that having a felony conviction impacts jury service and ability to enter the legal profession. The core of our work, though, relates to anti-carceral lawyering. This is our advocacy work and our sort of work out in the world. And our goal here is to work directly with live organizing campaigns. When I say that our theory of change is that in order to end mass incarceration, you have to build power within the communities most directly impacted by it, we're sort of borrowing a theory of change that is related to the practice of community organizing. We work really closely with Professor Marshall Gans over at the Kennedy School, who's one of the country's leading thinkers and scholars and teachers of community organizing, which is all about how do you build people power at the grassroots level to overcome power that is elite power or instantiated power or conventional power. And what we're trying to do at the Institute, being centered at a law school, is help lawyers think about how to best work in support of organizer-led campaigns against mass incarceration. How do you teach lawyers how to bring the skills and the knowledge that lawyers have to the table without turning your colleagues in the movement work into clients? How do you avoid making people who are trying to build authentic, robust, enduring community power among themselves, you don't want to turn them into passive clients who are waiting for lawyers to solve their problems by filing a lawsuit. So what we do is we work in close collaboration with coalitions of organizers that are engaged in live campaigns against mass incarceration, including campaigns about carceral infrastructure. One of our main projects right now is a carceral infrastructure project, where we are working with campaigns across the country that are trying to stop the construction of new carceral facilities or to close existing carceral facilities. And this brings us to the theme of this gathering today, because I think it's important to stress that carceral infrastructure, these buildings that we've spent the time so far talking about, are central to mass incarceration. It's almost maybe an obvious thing to say that prisons are central to incarceration. Let's just pause for a moment and observe how carceral infrastructure is so intimately tied to not just mass incarceration as in the buildings, but mass incarceration, the social phenomena. Right? These are buildings that, first off, have economies to them. They are massively expensive to build. Prisons today can cost $500 million to construct, and they exist all across the country. As a result, there are industries connected to carceral infrastructure. There are massive vested interests in carceral infrastructure continuing, and you cannot end mass incarceration without encountering the folks who have a strong interest in it existing because it is tied to billions of dollars of construction and wealth. This is not just the private prison companies that we heard about from Sarah, but more broadly than that. There are communities that are sometimes essentially sold prisons by their elected officials on the promise that the prison will be the economy boost. This is a narrative that has proven tremendously successful time and again, notwithstanding the fact that it is untrue. There's pretty good research on what the actual economic impact of putting a prison into a town does, and it does bring in jobs that are public sector jobs, prison guards, and that is offset by the jobs that basically flee the community, because being a prison town, it turns out, is actually not attractive for the town. The things that it draws in are prison guards and big shop stores, and then creates a bit of a sort of economic wasteland and depression, where most of these towns actually end up worse off after the fact, oftentimes with essentially buyer's remorse. But you have to understand that all of these things are happening. There's economic power behind prison construction. This ties to a second thought about why carceral infrastructure is so central to mass incarceration, which is, we heard mentioned at the beginning from Lisa and Dana about this famous prison abolitionist scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore, whose book Golden Gulag talks all about the political economy of prisons, which is separate from the way that they are viewed as profit centers or income generators by some folks. They are also the way in which society deals with essentially economic surplus and the fact that economic inequality produces people who are, because of criminogenic social forces, pushed into criminal offending. A society that is going to have large inequality is going to have that issue, and prisons are essentially the container into which those people are put. It is an absorption mechanism for social inequality in a society. You need to be able to eliminate that container to force society to deal with social inequality in a different way. Finally, and most fundamentally, carceral infrastructure is so important to address to end mass incarceration because, as folks in this room will know better than most, buildings have life cycles. Buildings are not always meant to last forever. And as we heard earlier, the rise in mass incarceration entailed a predictable prison boom. A huge number of prisons were built essentially during the 1980s. And their life cycles are coming due. There's literature within the sort of prison building industry that is circulating this as an opportunity moment. It's like, hey, remember all those prisons we built back in the 80s? We got to build them all again. Business opportunity. The flip around for those who are trying to end mass incarceration is this is a potentially critical opportunity and moment in time. That if you miss it, you are letting society invest in another generation of the current amount of carceral infrastructure. In other words, if you spend these next few years rebuilding the prisons of the 80s for another 50 years, you're buying into 50 more years of the current amount of carceral infrastructure. And if you build it, they will fill it. So interrupting carceral infrastructure is essential to forcing societies to pause and say, wait, do you really want to spend that $500 million on a new prison, or do you want to spend it on something else? This is why, as part of our work, our institute is part of a coalition that launched earlier this year to oppose the construction of a new prison in eastern Kentucky. That prison would be called FCI, Federal Correctional Institute Letcher. It would be the latest of more than a dozen prisons built in central Appalachia in the last 20 years. We saw pictures before of Texas. I mentioned Golden Gulag, which is all about prison construction in California. What many folks might not know is central Appalachia is one of the most concentrated areas of prison building in the country. Part of the reason for that is that central Appalachia was also the central place for coal mining. And as coal mining and the coal industry is receding, there are flat mountains all across central Appalachia. Flat because prison companies come and blow up the top of the mountain in order to scoop out the coal. And then when they're done, they leave the flat mountaintop. There's a federal law that says that those mountains are supposed to be reclaimed and restored, a sort of environmental justice situation, unless they can be put to other beneficial uses. Well, across this area, many policymakers have decided what better beneficial use than to put a prison on that flat space. So there are prisons being built throughout central Appalachia on these blown off mountaintops, and the latest proposal from the federal government is to put FCI Letcher there. I should say it's not actually a proposal from the federal government, it's a proposal from Congress. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have told Congress that they don't need this new prison, they don't want this new prison, and that they can think of better uses for the $500 million this prison would cost. But the congressman from the district where this prison would be built is also the chair of the relevant appropriations committee and has bought into the idea of prisons as local economic boosts. So we work with a group of folks called Building Community Not Prisons. That's a coalition of organizers, activists, environmental justice activists, anti-carceral activists in Letcher County, throughout Kentucky, throughout the South, trying to prevent this prison from being built. It is one of dozens and dozens and dozens of campaigns across the country happening right now where local folks on the ground are trying to say, we don't want this prison here. We don't want new prisons anywhere. We want to not invest in another 50 years of mass incarceration, but recognize that if you think mass incarceration should end, a radical, obvious idea, you have to start deconstructing it, sometimes brick by brick. I think that central to that work is building community, not just in Kentucky, building community wherever we are, including across intellectual aspects of community, which is why I think it is so essential and wonderful to be having this conversation at a design school with folks who are thinking about this not from the perspective of law, but of physicality and spaces, and seeing the connection between these buildings and one of the most significant and enduring social injustices, I think, facing our country, that much like a wall in a jail in Chicago, seems really, really permanent until it falls over.
We're going to try to reconvene. To start off the discussion, we have one more sort of little mini presentation. Last night we held, Dana and I held a workshop for our students here, which we called Reading Carceral Landscapes, which was an event intended to start, or at least begin the process of thinking about how we might evaluate the aesthetics of jail and prison buildings and their cell blocks today. So we invited students to come and join us and read, as we put it, for evidence of architectural principles within carceral spaces as experienced by those imprisoned. And we used work from the Prison Writing Archive, so using the voices of people who are incarcerated, knowing that these are the people who are the foremost experts of this architecture, to begin to develop, let's say, an editorial position for how we might think through design principles using their expertise. This, Dana and I think, is really just the beginning of this kind of work that might unfold. But I want to invite one of our students, Rachel Fischer, who was there last night and who's going to share some thoughts from that workshop. Oh, there you are. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Fischer. Thanks so much for hosting that workshop last night. It was really amazing. And honestly, one of the things that I hope to do at the GSD, I'm a first-year Master of Urban Planning student, and I come from a background of social justice, mainly with the reproductive justice lens, but I've become really excited might be the wrong word, but excited to explore how reproductive justice and justice work, such as we've been looking at here, are very intertwined, especially when we look at carceral landscapes from the perspective of gender. So I've been really excited to do this, and I hope this is just the beginning of workshops like the one we had last night. So groups of three groups looked at an archive of essays as described, much of which is letters and essays from those who have experienced incarceration firsthand. We narrowed this down by mostly just looking at Massachusetts because of the wide range of incarcerated experiences that might exist in an archive, such as the one we were reading. We explored 3 themes, which are often integral to architecture as a discipline: thresholds, climate, and materials. And through these readings, we explored prison architecture by those who have experienced it. I was in the materials group, and we read about metal, concrete, and the loud reverberating sounds that these materials make. They are used and they have a lot of life in them, and often interrupted by just our daily life processes because of the noises that it might interfere. These materials keep sound in, and while noise is amplified on the inside, no sounds are often heard on the outside when using these materials. Monotony and repetition of these materials deprive the range of sensory experiences available to incarcerated peoples, keeping people in walls and allowing them to see what's on the outside with windows and lack thereof. The thresholds group explored the same dynamics of inside and outside, both infrastructurally, but also emotionally. The thresholds and boundaries of our bodies, the bodily harm that can be inflicted by being other, and by being forced from thresholds of maybe general population to the thresholds of solitary confinement. And this is often due to identities that people hold, such as sexual orientation. We explored how these landscapes of carcerality restrict the ability to express emotions such as sadness and grief, both inside and outside the prison. Lastly, the climate group explored the air breathed by those experiencing incarceration, and again, or lack of air. Generally, prisons are stuffy or smelly. Those were some of the words that kept recurring. And individual cells and dormitories lack air. I would like to share a powerful reading that we did that kind of encapsulates some of the sadness and grief that we read in the architecture and aesthetics. There was a story of an individual who realized that the only airflow in their space was right under the door crack, and there was light coming through. That's how they knew that that was really the only airflow. So they were able to manipulate their own access to air by stuffing this space. And through this, they were able to die by suicide by restricting this airflow, by lighting a fire in this space. So these readings that we did in the workshop allowed us to explore how the built space has the ability to remove a sense of humanity, remove dignity, remove access to green space, community, and comfort. Architects, planners, designers, we have to use design and the tools and materials and thresholds and climate to restore humanity and life in these spaces. So thanks again for this opportunity to do this workshop. It was amazing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who was there last night, and we will do it again, or expand on it. I want to invite everyone to come, all of our panelists to come up. Ana Maria will be hosting us, but please, everyone join in conversation. We hope, we really intend this to be a conversation.
Folks, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here, and Lisa and Dana for just involving me and making me part of this amazing and really important conversation. I just want to facilitate the conversations that I think have already started. And I thought perhaps I would just start with a prompt about inertia and mutability. The idea that that some buildings resist demolition, countered by Melanie inviting us to think that these spaces are not permanent, that we can imagine a world without them, and Andrew's sort of urgent call on the timeliness and the key opportunity that we have. So if you could perhaps both, each one of you respond to each other on the role of architecture in the sort of reversing the inertia of how the system tends to resist change, while at the same time arguing for mutability and transformation of that system.
I mean, I think it's a both and. When you were explaining to us also about the life cycle of the prison and mentioning this kind of 40-year, right? 30, 40 years, often what we think of sometimes in terms of a building life cycle. And also when I was talking about the extent to which an investment is fixed and situated and what that means to have money situated in a geography, in a series of relationships with investors, with townspeoples. I mean, there are so many, every agreement for these places has the word intra in front of it. There are so many complex agreements that are made that pave the way for building these places. So what I mostly think in response to what you're asking us is that it's important for us to think about inertia. It's important for us to think about the building's own restrictions, requirements, demands, and then put that back in relationship to the systems that support it, enable it, that we might then be able to push against. So I really do think it's a both and. You know, it's both thinking about that building and the way that it has a series of relationships we need to look carefully at that act upon the decisions that are then made to hopefully dismantle it.
I love the question, Ana Maria, because it reminds me so much of this picture that Melanie shared of the wall, right? Things that seem immutable, things that seem inevitable, feel that way until the moment that they aren't, right? I mean, if we think of just sort of massive social change, there's almost always that kind of moment of tipping point where suddenly something seems possible that didn't seem possible before. And what I love about the question is the question of what is the role of architecture or design in helping that tipping point happen. And I guess a couple thoughts, and I should say as the beginning, this is me speaking to you as an outsider, right? I have never studied architecture or design. I don't have the grounding in it as a discipline. But I do think of it as central to this question for the reasons I said towards the end, right? There's a built reality of mass incarceration, which means there are builders. And there's a question of what's the role of a school of builders in that. And I can think of a few things. One is a question of, maybe for lack of a better word, like vocational ethics, right? So I think of this at a law school all the time, because it's very obvious to me that some of the central builders of mass incarceration were lawyers. Legislators, either trained as lawyers or aided by lawyers, write the laws that allow for the sentences to be as long as they are. I didn't say this during the talk, but one of the main reasons why the United States incarcerates so many more people than other countries is because our prison lengths are much, much, much longer. Lawyers did that, or lawyers were central in that. Every single person in prison has been directly touched by at least two lawyers. There was a lawyer who's called a prosecutor who decided to charge them with a crime and to request a certain sentence. And there's another lawyer in a robe called a judge who decided to impose that sentence. Those individual decisions, when you add them up, create mass incarceration. There's a question then that lawyers have to ask themselves as a profession, as a vocation, a kind of looking in the mirror set of questions. What was our role in this? And I could imagine a series of similar look in the mirror types of questions for design and architecture as a vocation, right? What does it mean to design a prison? What are the sort of vocational ethics that a community called towards building as a calling thinks about when it comes to being asked to build certain types of spaces? What is the conversations that have to happen internal to that? And again, I'm not part of those conversations. I assume that they are happening. But one piece is like putting that vocational ethics front and center. A second, I think, is imagination. I love being here and seeing this talk because I already learned so much. I was telling Lisa that just seeing the pictures allows me to see the ways in which there's a to a non-architect, a subliminal language of incarceration that's intentionally put there. Imagining a different subliminal imagination is really important. I'm thinking of this conference that I was at a few weeks ago that brought together folks working to stop all these prisons and had some folks from architecture firms there, including this firm Design and Justice, led by Deanna Van Buren, who had been here at the school as a Loeb Fellow. She shared these amazing slides of how she practices as an architect to imagine other things in these spaces. Sometimes that does involve demolition, knocking it down. Sometimes it involves just a radical but practical reimagination of a space, which architects are trained to do, that can hold on to the memory of what it was, because it's important not to forget those memories and what happened in those walls, but create the possibility of a new use of a space that is literally transformative. I think that's a lot of what this profession can do. And the third is education, right? Again, coming back to this is like my work. And I sat here and within 5 minutes, just seeing these slides, had this real insight of, gosh, I've been looking at prisons for decades and don't know that I fully appreciated until hearing the opening presentation, the way in which they are constructed to tell me things through my eyes that almost kind of bypass the thinking parts of my brain and send me all sorts of messages that folks who are trained in that language can make explicit, and then that becomes another part of the conversation about what the system is doing and how deeply it gets its fingers into our culture through things like the language of cultural creation that is the public art all around us, the public architecture all around us, helping educate about how there is a message almost, I'm thinking of the movie Inception, like snuck in to that language that can then be part of our brains. You all can help see that and teach that, and I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, so I'm kind of part of a movement of historians, maybe of just two of us, who are really working to push part of a movement, yes, who are trying to think about kind of mass incarceration as having a much deeper historical context. And so, my book covers almost 200 years of jail history. My collaborator, John Bardas, has a book coming out with UNC Press called Carceral City that is going to help us to understand the role of places like slave jails and plantation dungeons as places where mass incarceration was pioneered during the age of slavery. So I want to say this is part of a deep but not inevitable story, right? Every history of these spaces contains contestation, right? And these spaces are being kind of, right, people are making choices about how to use these spaces in deeply political ways. One of, I guess, kind of two things about this. One is just to emphasize, I think maybe a bigger takeaway of what I had to say earlier, right, is that the experience of jail is unstable across a single institution, right, across multiple buildings on the 100-acre site of Cook County Jail. Right, I was really interested in I think it was Bristol County Jail picture from the workshop slides, right, depicting a jail that again looked to me from the 19th or early 20th century, right? So these experiences are unstable right now. People in Cook County Jail Division 5, which was built in the 1970s, I think, or maybe 1980, for example, are only have access to dirty water. Right, the water that comes out of the faucets is gray. There's often not hot water. Advocates are getting repeated reports of this from people who are released from jail. That's not true across every unit of the jail, and there are ways that the good buildings are kind of used to justify the bad buildings. Oh, well, if we just stop housing people in this one dangerous building, if we close it or shut it down, then we have a good jail. And I think like resisting this like good, bad binary, when we talk about Sheriff Tom Dart arguing that Cook County Jail was the largest mental institution in America, one of the things that he was trying to do, that it took me forever to actually like line up the dates and appreciate this as a historian, he was justifying the construction of the residential treatment unit, which is essentially supposed to be a kind of like hospital jail, which is one I should have kind of incorporated into the talk. But one that was pushed through with very little public information, very little public comment. So like he almost had the justification out in front of like any kind of tangible realization, I think, among a lot of people that a new building had been built. So there are ways that people can speak to public sympathy to try to get you to overlook certain of the kind of like material built aspects of what's happening in these facilities. One kind of piece I want to kind of throw in here, because you guys are designers, and again, thinking about, you know, your professional ethics and morality. Right, Ruth Gilmore has this great quote, like, where life is precious, right? And as I was sitting here, I was thinking of that has a spatial aspect to it that just never quite hit me before. But one of the questions that activists in Chicago are beginning to talk about is, what do we do with the fact that most of these jail spaces are not ADA compliant? They're hitting their expiration date. Right, the buildings, many of the buildings from the 70s have already been torn down because their HVAC was crap from day one. They're going to be facing these questions of like, what do we build? Do we have jail space that's accessible? And what kind of modifications do we bring to these spaces, or can they be modified? Because there's been for about a decade, like, civil rights suits from incarcerated people who can't take showers, who, right, the place is just not wheelchair accessible. So, you know, as Ruthie Gilmore says, do we tweak Armageddon, right? Do we make the jail ADA accessible, or do we imagine a world where disabled people aren't jailed, or where nobody is jailed? So I think like bringing, you know, on the one hand, we have these like very material realities, and can we make an improvement in somebody's day-to-day life, right? This is a real moral question. On the other hand, like, how does it relate to this hundreds of years long trajectory, right? And like expectations that we have of kind of what we see when we see a jail or a prison or a migrant detention center.
I feel Andrew may have something to say.
I think it is such an essential insight that Melanie's raising, right? It's like the central tension in thinking about how do you deal with an aging carceral infrastructure and the fact that there are 2 million people in there now, right? And it's a hard question. At this conference that I mentioned that we were at a few weeks ago, it was a tense question. It's a divisive question. Because, you know, when Melanie talks about the legal components of this, you know, civil rights lawsuits, upcoming ADA lawsuits, these are lawsuits brought by the folks that, if you're sort of the political left, you would think of as like your fellow travelers, right? It's like the ACLU, civil rights lawyers, doing the kind of, at least in certain sort of stories that my profession tells itself, the heroic good thing of a civil rights lawyer, right? You see people suffering, you see pain, you file a lawsuit, and you go tell a judge, this is wrong, this is unjust, you have to do something about it. And that worked in terms of its stated goal, which was a lot of these prisons were put under consent decrees where the judges said to the prison wardens and to the state, this is an unconstitutional setup you have here. You are violating these people's rights under the 8th Amendment. Your jail is the definition of cruel and unusual punishment because gray water, because overcrowding, because there's no health facilities. And we can pause for a moment and think like, that sounds good. People shouldn't not be able to drink or not have access to a doctor if they get hurt inside of a prison. The problem, and there've been sort of academic studies on this, of sort of the history over the impact of these, is perhaps because mass incarceration is so entrenched in our mindset, The response over and over again of system actors when a judge tells them you're running an unconstitutional system, you don't have the capacity to incarcerate people in a way that is humane, is, we hear you, Judge. We need to build new prisons. We can solve that if we build, you want clean water? We can build clean water. So then they take the judge's order and they go to the legislature and say, whatever the priorities you have, I know you had schools on the budget, I know you had whatever on the agenda, I'm now under a court order to put that money into this prison to build a better prison. And prison expansion follows, precisely because folks don't even have the, again, the idea of like radical obvious imagination, to realize that like one way to not have an unconstitutional prison is to close the unconstitutional prison. That doesn't register. And so as a result, this litigation sometimes has the perverse, unintended, but real and now documented impact of putting this real just conundrum, right? Like, what do you actually do then? You obviously don't want people to be living in pain, and if you can mitigate pain, that feels important. And at the same time, how do you do that in a way that isn't then immediately leading into, again, 50 years of investment in new sparkly carceral infrastructure that is still separating people from their families, still doing all of the many, many horrible things that come with what it is to have mass incarceration.
Yeah, please. So I think what's so interesting that I'm hearing, and this is making me think, is that the world of immigrant detention, and I didn't talk about CAR facilities, which is the criminal alien requirement facilities, is where so-called criminal aliens are detained. So the detention infrastructure and CAR infrastructure is run by two different, Bureau of Prisons versus ICE. But a lot of people who consider themselves migrants have moved between those systems and between those facilities, and the architectural language of those facilities in Texas and much of the country is similar. A lot of what you guys are talking about just does not apply in the world that I'm looking at. There is no HVAC system to be upset about it not working. There is no HVAC system. There is no law that is supporting the basic rights of citizens, that they are, the lawyers who I know who are fighting this are talking about human rights at a global scale, because there are no protections for the people that are in these systems. So the level of degradation that you're looking at when you're looking at immigrant detention is unfortunately, I almost feel like Texas is the potential bad future of what will happen if everyone who has these, agreements, these judges, give the carte blanche for more building. What you will get is what we have in Texas, which is these 1,000 person rectangles that are put up in 1 year now, in 12 months. And so again, like thinking about space and how it's produced and how you fight it, we used to have 3 to 5 years to fight it. Now, once the funding's unlocked, there's 12 months, right? So it's like the mobilization has to happen quick, and it has to happen at the front end. So that's just one thought. And then one other thing, I'm not an architect by training, just to situate perhaps something I might say right now that's wrong, if someone here in the audience knows. But so in terms of the ethical responsibility of the profession, I know that the organization that Raphael Sperry, if I'm saying his name correctly, that I showed, that I flipped at the beginning of my talk, they've been working for, I believe, decades to get the AIA to say that they would not professionally condone solitary. And that was recently won. So if you want to get a sense of the enormous gap between the AIA, in my opinion, and any kind of ethical language about prison design, like way behind the times. Because to say no to solitary in 2020, is like, it's very easy to understand that should not be designed, and there's no need for it in any prison for any person, period. You don't have to make a radical argument. And the profession has been stamping those drawings with solitary until very recently. So, people need to support the activists in that world who are pointing these things out, like Raphael.
I had a question. Thank you so much for that. I had a question on visibility, because it seemed to me there was a running thread in all your presentations on how these spaces, massive, enormous spaces, are concealed, are made invisible, are made to migrate to the mountaintops, to faraway sites, right, to disappear through the ankle bracelet that Melanie mentioned. Hard to come by plans, right? It seems like a deliberate concealment of an enormous system. And every time we sort of are able to pinpoint one of these facts of the system, we try to flip them, right? So how can we make the system more visible? And I'm thinking at the scale of the person, of the building, of the landscape, of the country, right? At any scale that you can think of. But when I think, Sarah, you mentioned the distance from cities, right?
I mean, so this question of visibility, so Melanie and Andrew were bringing up these older prisons also that are in cities. The Cook County Jail is in Cook County. And again, if we see Texas as the dystopic future, not as the dystopic present, you have these struggling, they were once agricultural-based towns and ranching towns that have turned to prison as the economic mainstay. Again, to your point, much of which has been refuted, and a lot of people have moved out, and those towns are not thriving. But the point is that this idea of remoteness and invisibility is like a science. So I was actually, when I was deep in this research, I was really, and I did tons of FOIA. I was like, because it's all private. So I was like, FOIA,
tell
FOIA,
students
FOIA.
what FOIA is.
The Freedom of Information Act request, where you can get, the fact that taxpayer money is supporting private prison for immigrant detention means we are allowed, theoretically, to know about how these places function, look, operate, right? There is a rights issue there. So it is under the FOIA jurisdiction, kinda, because the private prison companies also have a lot of control over what they're willing to share. But I was trying to get into the documents where it is the people who are determining where to put these facilities, like who are doing the math and the logistical work, kind of like an Amazon warehouse, of like picking where to put the facilities. And it really is this science of remoteness. It's like you have to have a road that goes there. It has to be accessible from an airport in case you're deporting people, right? Like you have to take all the factors. And yet, literally being that 105 miles from pro bono lawyers, from legal advocates, from immigrant rights groups, means that in order to protest this place, which I've done this with people where we drive out to Dilley, and then we're there, 50 people in the middle of nowhere. So then you need the media, and you don't just want a little bit of media, you need a lot of media, right? To make it actually seem like it has the size that it has. So I think this visibility question, I don't have an answer. And I think it really is a problem, because I feel like they're really crafting these systems that are making the messages that reach the media so curated. The same thing with the remoteness now. If you see a judge remotely, or if you're doing an audit of a facility remotely, all you're seeing is what the camera's pointing to show you. You're not walking through the space, you're not having the serendipitous encounters that lead to things being breached. So it is, I think, about getting ICE to be accountable. Like, they have to change policy for there to be a different kind of visibility. I don't think it's just about more media. Of course, we want more protest, more grassroots protest, but anyway.
I think it is such an important question, and Sarah's comments are just spot on. I mean, she talks about a science of remoteness and invisibility, and it makes me think that there is also just a deep politics of remoteness and invisibility that is central to mass incarceration on sort of almost both ends of it. One is you need to hide the prison in order for the sort of central story about what America is to be a story you can keep telling. It reminds me of this book that you've probably heard of, How to Hide an Empire, which is not talking about mass incarceration. It's talking about, I mean, this hits home for me as a Puerto Rican. How do you like tell the story of like no taxation without representation, no colonialism, no, we're the country that fought off empire and invented democracy, and at the same time own an island of 3 million people that can't vote and are taxed without representation and that are in a colonial status, as recently reaffirmed by the Supreme Court. How do you hide that? And then the key part is you have to hide it to be able to keep telling the story that is the origin story and the cultural religion of America, right? So too with mass incarceration, right? Nation of freedom, right? Like how do you? I was sitting with a judge recently here in Massachusetts who talked about how he was part of this delegation to go to, I think it was Uzbekistan or something, where one of these things where like the United States is sending, we send our judges to like tell other judges how to do like the gold standard of American justice. And he went and he was giving his talk, and a judge there interrupted and said, how can you come and talk to us about how to build the golden standard of justice when you incarcerate somebody, right? Like you have to hide it, otherwise that becomes just apparent to everybody. So it's central to the legitimacy of the hiddenness. But then there's also a reason why the remoteness, that also has its own politics to it. And Ruth Gilmore talks about this a lot. There's a terrific book called Coal Cages in Crisis by a man named Judah Shept that's talking about, well, why are these prisons built where they're built? And what are the stories we tell ourselves about the places where we're building them? What are the stories we tell ourselves about Appalachia? What are the tropes that come to mind when we talk about West Virginia, right? And there are stories we tell ourselves about waste and, hillbilly, right? There is a devaluing of the places where the prisons get built. Mm-hmm. That also kind of makes it even more possible to tell the story there. You need this prison because no one else is going to invest here because we're a place that the country forgot, right? So like there's both pieces of it about that distance. I think one central piece, at least on the first part, is finding ways to use narrative to shrink that. That's why I put up that slide of the Visiting Room Project. I highly recommend this to you. You can just go to their website or Google Visiting Room Project, and you can just pick little, they have one at a time, and they're these incredibly powerful, you click, the screen is just a person against a black screen just talking to you from inside Angola prison. And when we screened this last week, it just is immediately apparent to everyone in the room, like, gosh, they sound just like people who are not serving life without parole sentences. And all of those, because distance allows you to tell a narrative, a caricatured narrative of what people in prison are like. Mm-hmm. And because it's so far away, it's impossible for folks who don't make that travel in distance to know if that narrative and that character is real or if it's again, an ideological narrative that helps justify putting people in there. If you can find ways to break through that distance and wall, and the Visiting Room Project is a great example of that, where you suddenly feel like you're having a conversation with someone, and any preconceived notions you might have about the people who are in prison just fall away when you're kind of be able to have that conversation. And the amazing thing about that is that project is it kind of makes it almost feel like, millions of people across the country sitting with their laptop can kind of have something close to that conversation across a table, even though the person is locked up and recorded that 5 years ago and is 100 miles away from you. There's this other film that's going to be part of the screening we're doing next week called Calls from Home, which again I highly, highly recommend. It's a short documentary film by a woman named Sylvia Ryerson that's all about this distance question, and that is following families from DC as they try to first get together the money, mm-hmm. and then make the journey that is sometimes a once in a lifetime journey from DC 400 and plus miles up to the mountain so that they can see their family member for the visit for this decade, mm-hmm. right? That comes through film in a way that can really, this isn't just a changing minds thing, this is a changing hearts thing, and you need to be able to speak to the emotional morality of what this is. And I think that these films are things that really can do that, and that can start to shrink distance and create visibility that's not just something you see with your eyes, but that you really see and feel.
I couldn't help but note on that point, just the importance of personal narratives in all of your work, and in thinking and processing the scope of this problem with just one person that you bring, and sort of that sort of direct conversation of a person-to-person humanity. So such an important part of all of your work. I have more questions, but I also want to just start preparing the audience to warm up your questions. So maybe you can, or if you have them already, perhaps, okay. Amazing. I have more, but I would love to hear yours, so maybe let's start here, but wait for the mic so we can all hear you. Great, thank you.
Hello, and thank you so much for everything that's happened today. I appreciate all the work that all of you are doing. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
This is really awkward.
No.
I have a question which I'll wait till later, but I wonder if anyone on the panel has read Every 12 Seconds by Tim Patcherat, where he's a political scientist and he talks about the politics of sight. And this book is about his experiences going undercover in meatpacking and meat slaughtering facilities, which need to be remote, which need to be invisible, not necessarily because of the work they do, but also who works there. And really what I find fascinating about the text and kind of the argument that he puts out, which I think holds in all of the cases that we're talking about in terms of incarceration, is as much as we have invisibility and remoteness, on the inside we have a world of hyper-surveillance and hyper-visibility. And so we have this dialectical relationship around the politics of sight. And I think there's a lot of nuance when we think about sight and visibility, and who might think these are visible institutions, who might think they're visible institutions. And so I just wanted to put that out there for discussion.
That's great. Well, one interesting thing is that a lot of the people in those meat packing plants are people who then end up in detention centers because they have the ICE raids, you know, and they'll arrest 200 people. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's, you know, when these places feel invisible to people who are not incarcerated, I think it's because we're experiencing these places maybe unwittingly. This is actually like the state making an argument about the value of human life and human potential. And so I think, you know, it becomes incumbent upon us, right? This is why I kind of try to talk about the jail as peopled, right? That jails are just not detention spaces or punishment spaces, but these are political spaces. I think that becomes important, you know, as we resist the kind of disappearing quality. Part of why, part of the frustration of my work, and again, that may be my own kind of sense of personal narrative here, is like, the Cook County Sheriff is operating the least transparent jail regime in the history of the jail. And so everything people tell me, like, oh, Cook County Jail, I know about Tom Dart. It's like, yeah, because you heard that from Tom Dart. You know, and like his people from his press office are probably watching this now. Like, hey guys, they've reached out to me before about talks I've given. And so, I mean, you know, like, this is a political battle, right, for visibility, not just visibility, but legibility, right, for us to know what we're looking at. And so Sarah's point about using the Freedom of Information Act is so key, because you think about yourselves as planners, designers, architects, you know every single document, right, that is going to go into a permitting process, right, that's going to be part of planning, that's going to be part of the story of a building being proposed and ultimately built. Activists don't know what those things are called, and you often need, right, really precise titles to get that information. So FOIA activism is one of the major frontiers of activism, because just getting the knowledge is such a barrier to getting kind of a more legible institution. I think also too about like demanding to visit institutions. People don't realize this, but the League of Women Voters in the 1960s and 70s was thousands of women all over the country were touring prisons and jails. They like had little jokes about it in their newsletter, like, "Where's mom? Oh, she's gone to jail." And it was like because these women were being the eyes and ears of their community as they demanded good government, right? And if you think about yourselves as people who understand buildings, if you can demand, right, as a public to visit and see inside these institutions, you can read what's happening to that building with a very specific form of expertise, right? There are things you can see that I can't see as a historian, or that Andrew can't see as a lawyer, right? And so I think, you know, as we think about, right, these kind of the barriers to visibility, legibility, knowledge formation, right, we can think about it as something that, like, this is all evidence of a political contest that we're in as we think about these buildings.
Did you have a question?
It was more of a comment, but it was, yeah, kind of go to these spaces.
The mic.
Hi, it was more of a comment. It was mostly to speak to the question of invisibility and to urge people to go to these spaces and to agree with Melanie that in a jail setting in a county, that's actually pretty possible and feasible for a lot of folks. And I was going to also add that, you know, there are many members of our community for whom the jail is not invisible, and it is a very regular part of their lives as they go and visit their loved ones. And it's often invisible, you know, along race and class lines. And so, you know, there is that duality that Mary was talking about. And I would also add that, you know, the four of us are involved in prison education in the western part of the state, in Western Mass, mostly in jails. And, you know, education and higher ed, I would say to the folks in this room, is one way to really start to disrupt some of these systems, is to get into jails and prisons through higher ed and through, you know, providing opportunities for folks who are jailed or incarcerated to go to college. So that's it.
I mean, and to speak to like really being in the institution, not to just hammer this, but if you're paying attention to Pittsburgh, which is one of the best jail reporting in America is happening by this woman named Brittany Holler in Pittsburgh. She was learning about jail conditions by teaching a creative writing class in a jail, and she became so upset and so frustrated by what she heard that she's essentially helped to blow the lid off a massive scandal of jail conditions, dozens of jail deaths, and has really helped to mobilize the entire community to push for more accountability around jailing in Allegheny County. So, I mean, it really, mass movements are awesome, but you can do a lot with one person.
For those of you who are here at Harvard and affiliated with the school, either as students or others, I just want to give a shout out to a colleague and friend named Kaya Stern, who is at the Ed School, has been affiliated with Radcliffe, and has been just a real force for ways trying to get the university to have more involvement in prison education programs here locally. But if you want to seek her out, I imagine she will welcome hearing from you. The only other reaction I want to say was I think both of these comments, the shared one, I didn't catch your name, but Mary's and yours, there's a sort of ripple effect of this duality you're talking about it being both invisible, like deeply invisible for a whole bunch of people, and then hyper visible, not just for the people who are inside, but the people who are transversing to visit. In that prison, precisely because of that duality, kind of exports a shame and a stigma, because it's so invisible that, like, if you're someone who's going in back and forth between, it's something that's so visible to you, right? You have a loved one. This is a huge part of your life. The jail becomes part of your city and your life in a really central way, in the same way that, like, I know this is a strange way to put it, but, like, you know, like, I think parents get a very different sense of, like, where the schools are in their community once they have school-age kids, right? Like, you know, that building that you drove by a bunch of times, and now you're like, oh yeah, that's Kennedy Elementary, and that's. Likewise, a jail can become very central as part of the built reality of a city to people who are in it. But then it's sort of hard to talk about sometimes because it is politically invisible by design. And I just say this from the experience of both having, you know, walked in and out of jails to visit clients, but then more recently as an educator, having students come and tell me, right, like, gosh, you know, this class feels like I did not feel like I could talk before about, you know, my dad in prison, because it's like, right, there's a message. What I'm trying to say is that too is a message that comes out, and there's a political consequence of that message, right? If there are people, including people who are, say, students at Harvard Law School, who feel like they can't talk to other students at Harvard Law School who will maybe go on to become senators or something about what it's like to be the child of someone presently incarcerated, because that duality exports a shame that is a silencing shame, and is an illegitimate shame, right? Like, is one that we should actually be creating the space for that conversation. That's another way in which invisibility suppresses a conversation that is a vital conversation, including a conversation that might be happening like here on our campus, right? That there are people who are very directly impacted, but something about the meta-narrative and the hypervisibility and the invisibility at the same time has an impact on what people feel like they can talk about, or at least can have the chilling effect on these necessary conversations that, again, could make it more visible. If you're sitting next to someone in class, and it's this class about, you know, prisons, and the professor's up there talking, you don't realize, like, oh, this is actually impacting a whole bunch of people in the room, and we don't know it, or half the people in the room don't know it, is powerful in a bad way.
I had a question on pedagogy that perhaps I should ask now, but while still collecting questions from the audience, I was just curious on how you bring your research into your classrooms. Because Sarah, you spoke of working with students, doing interviews. I mean, you all teach. If you could just share a little bit of the, you know, the courses that you teach and the students, the work of your students.
I'll be brief. So, like I mentioned, I got involved with the Humanities Action Lab, and so the exhibit that they produced, which my piece of it, my and my students' piece of it, was one of about, I think now they're up to about 30 installations, which deal with different states and different cities and different prisons. So that is a project I did as a class with my students, very much so, and with Casa Marianello, which is an immigrant shelter in Texas that I'm still affiliated with. But the other thing I'll say is that I teach a class right now called Material Histories and Ethnographic Methods. So prisons, and the way I've done this prison research has informed the kind of the thinking of the framing of that class. Very much to your point, Andrew, about changing the narrative or thinking about narrative. For me, as an architectural historian and as someone who has worked in design schools, I am very interested in working with students to help them understand how and why it's important to tell spatial and ethnographic narratives on whatever subject and topic they decide is the issue for them. You know, the issue for me is migration. Other people have, so that twinning of the material world with the personal experience, the biographical experience, perception, is something that I think can happen in an architecture school in a pretty unique way. And that is how this work has impacted some of the teaching.
I just love that you asked about this, because it's something that we as educators have as a kind of unique value add to the sort of movement work that this requires, right? We're teachers. I think about this obsessively. There's sort of two major ways in which I think of my pedagogy as actually central to the broader project. One is, so I mentioned, I teach a class called criminal law. And for folks who know anything about law schools, this is a required class. Any lawyer you've ever met has taken criminal law. It's a required class in their first year. And in most places, it's not a class about mass incarceration. And part of that's because it's taught out of case materials that are now case materials. The first edition of the 2 books that are mainly used were each written in like the late 60s and early 70s. And you remember that graph, right? It's like, then like the next year, right, things go vertical. So I spend a lot of my time right now working on a book, a case book, that the hope, I'm co-writing it with a professor named John Rappaport at the University of Chicago. The hope is that it can reorient this required class to do some of the things I suggested that architects do, right? Both educate and then reflect on the vocational ethics of how is it exactly that lawyers helped build mass incarceration? Mm-hmm. What is the way that these doctrinal questions we are studying, specific nuances of case law, connect up to the systems of power that are mass incarceration? So a lot of it is, my writing is pedagogical writing right now, invested in how to take this kind of core class that everyone has to take and try to really reshape it into one that makes it easier to learn the story of mass incarceration for lawyers. The other is that the institute that I mentioned has a class. If you go to our website is endmassincarceration.org. You can just see about one of our big pieces of our work. We call it a learning lab. Every year we get 6 to 12 law students who just become part of our team, and they just work on our projects. One of our students is going down to Kentucky in like a few weeks to be there for months as part of our effort to try to work with our partners on the ground about this prison. One of our former students is sitting in the audience, hey Joni, who now works for us. She's a lawyer, and works at the Institute, right? Like we're trying to train up lawyers, and Joni's sort of the trailblazer of that, to understand how lawyers can work with social movements, let them experience that in a classroom where they see their professor kind of take his tie off and say now let's look at what it means to actually do this work. And let's just do it together for a semester, for a year, for years and years and years on after that, right? And pretty quickly, I think all of us who have taught, one of the great things about teaching is pretty quickly, you have hundreds of former students. And pretty soon after that, you have thousands of former students. My mom was a public school teacher, and she said, teaching is how you change the world. If you think about your teaching as part of what you're trying to do to help people understand the problems around them and have the tools to do something about them if they want to.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the pedagogy has kind of been driving my research as well. I didn't really understand my book project until I went back to my own syllabus and was like, why am I teaching it this way, right? And it was about the kind of stories that resonated with students, where people were finding political efficacy, and these, kind of poignant stories of lived experience of incarceration that really pushed me to get beyond this kind of dry policy story, right? So I think learning from my students about what they've found effective has been really important to me. And kind of meeting them, the beautiful thing about teaching primarily 18 to 22-year-olds is that they're making decisions about their lives that are going to have consequences, forever. And so I think it's really pushed me to just present as many pivot points to them as possible. This is where somebody could have made a choice. They chose a different path. This is where somebody made this choice because of this. And I think just kind of trying to model that decision making and get them thinking about what it means to sit by and let something happen, what it means to challenge it across history. And again, I think not a lot of people are teaching this as a kind of 100 years long story. But I think putting ourselves in that kind of longer timeline opens up greater possibilities of what did society look like when there wasn't a formal jail, in the way that it looks like now. And I think the other kind of question for me is always going to be where is my classroom, right? And so I would say, some of the teaching experiences that I've felt, I think that kind of perfect reciprocity where we're both kind of benefiting from it is, either talking to journalists who are kind of asking tough questions to get kind of read in on what's going on with the jail, or, talking with activists who are working with the research, and really having those moments of kind of offering and listening, where we can get to a kind of more full picture of what these institutions are and really where the possibilities for organizing are.
I want to, again, pause for more questions that perhaps are percolating in the audience. Or from our organizers. Yeah, Dana? Hmm?
So one of the words that I've reconciled a lot over my interest in this space is abolition. And I think abolition means something a little bit different to each person. What does that word mean to you guys, and how do you position it within the framing that you guys have each shared with us today? And then if you have anything more spatially oriented, I'd appreciate that, but abolition.
I thought your definition was interesting, wasn't it? Because you were saying a spectrum from end to, and I forget what the word next to end was, to reduce, right? And actually, when I read that, I guess I was reading the words from your
Closed caption.
Because there's a kind of absolutist thing when you think of abolition. Like my instinct is to think of it in terms of ending. But thinking of it as a spectrum, I mean, abolition is an important term when thinking about immigrant detention and immigrant imprisonment, because, as I said, it's a black box. Like, it's not hard to make the argument that it is totally morally unacceptable and violent. It's totally well documented. I don't need to be up here saying that. There are people who have been heard by Congress and ignored. So it's a system that has to be completely rethunk, period. I really don't see there as being, I do think one way we can take a step forward is by literally shrinking the footprint of the carceral space to detain migrants. So I do believe in that project of shutting down facility by facility and supporting migrant shelter or immigrant-related service by service. I think that is one inroad. So if that can act as a countervalence to just the way that abolition might kind of shut one down because it seems so intractable, then that's kind of where I'm between, if that makes sense.
I think it's such a powerful word, right? And I think that's why it's kind of great to just ask a question about one word, because it's a word that is so present in this conversation, right? I think it's powerful for a lot of reasons. And when I was talking earlier about radical ideas or ones that are both obvious and fundamentally disruptive, the word abolition is, I think, used so centrally in work against mass incarceration because it is, I think, in one word, trying to capture that very idea and tie it to history, right? In the context of the United States, when you say the word abolition, it's impossible to say without thinking of a movement to end slavery, right? And there is such, and that it, in that one word, it captures that idea, something that is radically obvious, right? Like today, it's just obvious, both that slavery is wrong and that we never should have done it and that actually we have to reckon with it, and how massive it was to end it. There was a war, right, that divided the country. And I think that that's part of why the word is put so centrally in movements to end mass incarceration, because it's trying to capture that idea that radically obvious ideas are not just possible, but they can succeed. Right? In other words, it is in fact possible in a fairly young country to make a massive change in it and then to keep doing the work of it, because that's the other thing that I think the word is trying to invoke. It's invoking W.B. Du Bois and the idea of abolitionist democracy, which is what followed the abolition of slavery, right, which was the affirmative project of now building a society that actually abolishes what in legal discourse is often called the badges and infamy of slavery. In other words, once you abolish slavery, you have to keep abolishing slavery because there are all of the things that follow from it and the legacies of it that require abolition through building a new type of society in the place of the one that you changed, deconstructed. So I think those are two reasons why the world is so powerful. They're invoking the idea of both a radical imagination and the idea that there is a building that has to happen alongside of a deconstructing. I think, like all powerful words, they then can also be used to attack the things and the people that are trying to support them, right? So it's also a really explosive word, right? I think you can think of that in like the cousin phrase, right? Like defund the police, which has just gotten sort of so turned around by political opponents, because the double edge of the word abolition is it's just so easy. Again, this gets back to the idea of like, how can you even think of doing anything other than build a new prison when a judge tells you your prison's unconstitutional? In our system of mass incarceration has such a hold on our political imagination right now that if you say things like, oh, we should abolish prisons, it's really hard for people to comprehend. Because they immediately want to know, well, like, but then, what, like, or like, you're going to get rid of the police, but like, then what, like, what's going to happen, right? There's a fear that also comes with the word, which is why it's such a charged thing, right? There's like, it is almost in equal measure captures the radical possibility that is required to figure out how you would change an existing system pretty fundamentally, as was done before, and as I think the idea is we could do again. And at the same time, it, I think, prompts a lot of fear and backlash. And we're like living that moment now, right? There was like a period after Ferguson and after George Floyd where actually there was this surge of energy against mass incarceration. And then the predictable backlash and weaponization of that. And I think that's just something that folks working against mass incarceration have to constantly navigate, right? How do you both capture the power of radically obvious ideas and try to push them forward, and then guard against the retrenchment and backlash that is always going to come? And that's just politics. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean that in an essential way. Effective politics is a power struggle that doesn't quite just have a crisp, clean endpoint. It's you fight for what you believe in, and then you have to kind of keep fighting for it and defending it, continue the project of building it, again, in a kind of Du Boisian abolitionist democracy kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, I love this question as well. So like, I became an abolitionist in the course of this work. Writing a book about jails is probably the worst way it's a bad way to spend a decade, right? Like, especially, like, because you just spend a lot of time imagining jail. And I will not say that is in no way the same as being incarcerated. But I had to find a way to live with this project, right, just on a daily basis. And, you know, again, through reading widely, my colleague Manisha Sinha has a great book called The Slave's Cause that really finds that the kind of first white abolitionists, what was radicalizing them were slave rebellions. Because enslaved people were the first abolitionists, right? They could imagine themselves being free, and that's across the history of slavery, right? Enslaved people teaching each other how to read, enslaved people ministering to each other, creating a kind of theology of their own freedom and their own sense of value. So that sticks with me. Kind of another piece of that journey was the death of Sandra Bland in a jail in Texas. We're almost the same age. I'd had the experience of getting in my car to drive somewhere to start a new life, right? I got to make that drive. I got to do that. She didn't get to finish her drive. And I would say that pushed me to think with greater care and sensitivity about what I wanted to put my energy and imagination toward. to some extent that required listening to my own body, the sense of revulsion, like I'm always almost on the edge of throwing up when I'm in a prison or jail. My body just rejects it, if we're thinking about it in a spatial sense. The architecture, I think, makes you feel like that. And so I no longer felt obligated to think about abolition in terms of what's realistic, which is, I think, often how we have these policy conversations, and that's great for people over at the policy school. Like, I'm glad they're doing that work. But for myself, I need to have a maximum amount of hope to be able to spend this much time thinking about jails. And I need to, keep my own humanity by staying hopeful. And so for me, abolition, listening to incarcerated people and understanding what they are saying about the validity of their humanity, I think abolition gives me a tool. It's like a tool in my toolbox for better understanding the stakes of that, or not doing it. Not every person in prison is an abolitionist, but I think just bringing greater care and attention to, the context of incarcerated people, the ways that our society is failing them and their families in profound way. Abolition has helped me to appreciate that more fully. And I think, at times like this, when we're having a news week that feels especially heartbreaking and dystopian, a world without walls seems really good right now.
We have, a question right here from a student? Okay. Wait, who was first? Here and then over there? Okay.
Hello. So my question is a little bit about beyond prisons and jails. I feel like in my academics so far, I've also learned a lot about policing, surveillance, and the infrastructure and built conditions that bring about that as well. So if you have anything to say about that, as some students in design school, are there other architectures that you think we should consider that aren't maybe a little bit more everyday that we can be involved in? Yeah, thanks.
I mean, the spatial continuum is why space is so interesting, right? Like all the spaces, the city. And for my migrant spaces, there are discrete spaces like the Border Patrol station and the desert and, the detention center. But I'm currently focused on shelter. That's currently where my activism work has been, and we really need architects. Like and I'm not one, as I said. I wish I was, so I could just do the work that but it's not benign to be a pro bono architect and offer your services. Like, that is very valued. And groups like the shelters have very little money to actually build and do design. And so we need to, so I think thinking about shelter from the perspective of architecture could be really important.
One of my former students, Matt Guarglia, who's an amazing historian, has a great book coming out on policing. He works for the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, and they have talked a lot about everyday surveillance through things like Ring cameras, so people monitoring their doorstep for, sometimes animal life or their kids doing bad stuff, and other times it's like stealing their packages or whatever. And I think for me, like these kind of technological questions about what I've been thinking about is like boundless carceral space, that like one of the reasons why I've kind of been thinking about disaster is like something like martial law completely destabilizes kind of where the carceral is, and it turns out it's like everywhere. Not to like make us hopeless, but I think to for us to like think about the everyday forms of resistance. Do I want to not have a Ring camera, right? Do I want to commit to not surveilling my neighbors? Do I want to commit to a pedagogy of not doing, like some people call this like cop shit, like, right, where I'm not like harassing my students about attendance or whatever. And so, I mean, I think these like everyday choices that we make about our own consumption and our own social relations are actually really important to thinking about policing and surveillance kind of in space.
I'll just add that I think the most salient and hot, if you will, struggle and fight against carceral infrastructure in the country right now is in Atlanta, and it's about police infrastructure. Right? Many of you have probably heard about the sort of Cop City proposal. There's now a massive RICO indictment of protesters. As a lawyer, I can just say, like, reading that indictment is striking in that it's written unlike any other indictment I've ever seen, in that it opens with a deep discussion of the ideology of opposition to the carceral system, right? So it's clearly like a prosecution that there are specific acts that are being prosecuted. But separate from that, the prosecutors are making clear that they view their prosecution as also about taking on the ideas that are ideas like we don't want to have Cop City. But police infrastructure is central to that, right? I think related to that, when I was saying that Lisa's presentation at the beginning with the pictures really kind of opened my eyes to the language of architecture in a way that, and I just want to like come here now like every week and sit and take classes with you, because that just applies to all of these other buildings you're talking about. Police stations, courts. On the law side, there's a professor at Yale named Judith Resnick who wrote a whole book about just the iconography of courthouses. But you could imagine the same thing about the architecture of courthouses. What are the stories we're telling, right? And how do they have the same thing that Lisa's talking about, right? Lisa's saying, like, there's a story of rationality, of order, of neutrality that the prison is saying. There's all sorts of stories that we say about courthouses that are in some ways perhaps meant to communicate something like different than this is the building that produces 70 convictions a day, or 70 convictions an hour. This is the building that sends people to prison, right? It does other things too, right? But a huge thing that it does when I say that lawyers have helped build mass incarceration is in that building. That's the building where it happens. Mm-hmm. What's the architecture that we tell about that building to try to maybe, again, about hiding, keeping things invisible, to this duality of what's really happening in the stories we tell ourselves? I imagine, I hadn't thought about this before today, but that, gosh, the architecture of these places is telling a story. And is that story truthful to the full reality of what these buildings are, what is happening inside these buildings?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. This is a very broad question that you can choose to answer in whichever way. Maybe it ties to the research you've done or your pedagogy, but I was struck by the numbers on your presentation, Andrew, about how this is a problem on a larger scale than any other country in the world. I'm wondering if your research has taken you beyond the United States, and are there any sort of models or solutions internationally that can be tied to this work, or do you see this as an incredibly unique situation and system that we're within that sort of asks us to ask completely different questions? Just wondering about sort of the international comparison.
I think it's a great question, and in that it points in two directions, right? In one way, there's something universal about prisons at this stage. It's sort of strange. Prisons have a relatively recent history as buildings. And yet, so I should say, I'm not a comparative. I haven't done like global surveys. It's not, my focus is very much on the United States. But I would be surprised to learn if there are lots of countries today in the world that don't have prisons. In other words, I think that the prison is not a uniquely American institution at this point. So on some level, when we think of actually the power of the word abolition that Dana was asking about, if it's taken literally as a world without prisons, then that is actually not a uniquely American thing, right? There are prisons all over the world. In fact, there are countries that now follow, again, the American model in lots of ways, including plea bargaining, which we haven't talked about, but plea bargaining is a major driver of mass incarceration as a practice. And there's this book that's either just come out or is coming out in the next few months that's a global study of plea bargaining and how basically it's an American export and how countries all over the world are now learning that this device, and we can talk more about what plea bargaining is, but like one of the main impacts of it is it makes it possible to convict people much faster because you don't have a trial. You tell them, if you go to trial, we're going to charge you with these crimes that carry 50 years, and if you agree to plead guilty, we'll charge you with these other crimes that have a cap of 2 years. So like a lot of people take the 2 years, and that makes it much more efficient of a machine to produce mass incarceration, and that is now becoming globalized. So in other words, there are aspects of this that are not uniquely American. And then clearly, as the slide showed, there are aspects that are uniquely American. The scale of it, there is something distinctively American about mass incarceration. And if the question is why and what can we do about that, some thoughts. America also has really high social inequality, and it has a different way of addressing where it puts resources on the now very recognizable drivers of criminal offending, right? Public education, investments in social security, social safety nets. There are countries that take different approaches to that. That when they think of the public money that they have, they decide to invest it at the front end, early in life, and on the issues that are related to things like homelessness, unemployment, rather than putting that money into building a place to put people who are going to end up having the problems that come from not investing in that stuff. But I have to mention one other thing. The United States incarcerates vastly more people than other countries, with longer sentences. The United States does not have dramatically more crime than other countries, but it does have dramatically more violent crime than other countries. And the best research I'm aware of on this, it's contested like all academic research is, but there's this study that sort of stood some of the tests of time by Frank Zimmering and his co-authors that suggests part of this is just related to the fact that another major outlier for the United States is we have a lot more guns than everywhere else. So crimes that maybe would not be as violent in other places are more violent here, and they're violent in a way that creates massive pain. And one of the things that we study a lot in criminal law is how there is we call it a retributive impulse, that you can talk rationally about how incarceration is actually the worst way to deal with these problems. You should invest early on. But I don't know, if you've ever been like punched in the face and felt angry immediately, and you might recognize, look, I say this as a father of a 3-year-old who punches me in the face all the time, okay? I love this kid so much. And 3 seconds after he punches me in the face, I'm like, go into good parent mode. But when it happens, my body has a reaction that is like, man, I just got punched in the face. There is an instinct that we have when pain happens that triggers certain things. And if there's a lot more violence in your community, in your society, you have to then deal with the impulses that come from that can sometimes be an impulse to punish. And if you have more violence in your country, you might have more of that impulse. And that's something you have to deal with then, politically, psychologically, emotionally, morally, and that's a challenge.
I mean, I think there's, so one of the things historians think about, right, is I'm like, oh my God, there's a story about this from the 60s. And so, like one of the League of Women Voters members that I looked at, she went to, this nice lady from suburban Chicago. She got to go on a trip to Britain in the 1960s to tour their prisons and to see like what the British model could offer the US, right? This kind of prison tourism is really common. Policymakers love an all expense paid trip to Norway or Germany or the UK. And even though dying Twitter is like a cesspool, one thing I saw on there recently that I thought was really valuable was an incarcerated writer who was like, oh no, they're going to Norway. Things are going to get really bad around here. And it's because sometimes the going to search for better models is about performing a kind of cosmopolitan fantasia of like, oh, we have to search for the better models. We don't actually know how to improve our own institutions. Like, you could find the answers just talking to people within the prison or jail. They could tell you how to make a more humane institution. You don't have to go see how like predominantly white countries do it. And so I think the question of better models, right, is always going to be like, well, what's a good prison doing? And is there a good prison that's possible? And I would just say, like, similarly on the comparative front, Ben Weber has a book coming out from Basic Books. I can't remember the title, but I believe he came out of the Harvard History program on the Federal Bureau of Prisons and their kind of international imprisonment projects. So just kind of getting to that point of like, how do we really draw out what's a cultural export versus an import? The US has just been absolutely foundational to the knowledge formation around imprisonment. And I mean, this cuts all over the place. One of the Cook County sheriffs worked for the UN in the 1950s on the incarceration of Chinese prisoners of war in Korea. And then he like comes back home and gets elected Cook County sheriff. And so these are like transnational knowledge networks and modes of exchange.
Oh, okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and well, should we let's hear the 3 questions, and then you can reply to all of them.
Sure, great.
Yes. No pressure.
Thank you all for these incredibly stimulating talks, and this conversation is so important. I have a question sort of about hope and resistance, and it's a bit of a personal question for all of you as well. This discussion of the invisibility of incarceration and this projection of shame is so clear to me in a way I hadn't thought about before. It makes me think about the clear collusion of order and power, and how order, essentially makes invisible the violence it enacts, right? You've spoken about how it's necessary to disrupt that kind of order and challenge that violence, and I'm wondering if you could offer any insight on 2 things. First, what forms of resistance and disruption can we take? And second of all, like, what do you all can you do to keep you going? Because this work is incredibly, incredibly difficult.
We are going to collect the 3 questions. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's just been such like an insightful breath taken from different perspectives. I'm visiting from New York City. I was a former GSAP student, so I can't help but think about the closure of Rikers all throughout the conversations. And I guess, it's slightly nebulous, but what is, how do we introduce a wedge between this construction, this deconstruction and construction when there's a chronological deadline? They're talking about Rikers, it's got to close in 2027. We don't seem to have solution right now. The political structure doesn't seem to have space to introduce solutions. So I guess, how do we introduce a solution when we have the answers are being demanded? It's kind of like, the Titanic, the waters are rising. There's more people in the boat every single day, yet, there is still an iceberg. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone, also really enjoying this. I wanted to first give a shout out to a local campaign against new prison construction, the No New Women's Prison campaign. The coalition's called Building Up People Not Prisons, fighting the women's prison in Massachusetts is the oldest in the country, built in the 1800s, fighting for women to be released instead of a new facility being built. Along those lines, the place that fight is at a lot of struggle against the architecture firm, HDR, which has been contracted to design the facility. And both in this project and across the country, they use this rhetoric of building trauma-informed prisons and green space and natural light and kind of, I don't know, addressing a lot of the architectural features that were discussed here. So just asking for you to comment on that and how to push back on these, like, I don't know, almost architecturally rhetorical devices to, I don't know, make prisons sound pretty and nice.
How to push back against architecturally rhetorical devices to make prisons look nice. How to introduce a wedge between construction and destruction when answers are being demanded. And hope, resistance, and how to keep going. Super, super easy.
They started doing this at our faculty workshops when there were like 5 hands at the end in 5 minutes. They're like, let's just take all the questions. And I kind of love it. It's like the lightning, it's like my brain is like on fire right now, but it's like, I will speak quickly because I imagine both of you have more interesting things to say. I'll say like a sentence on each of these terrific questions. The first is a bit just more of like almost, again, an invitation to where you could maybe read more of interest to your question, Gavin, on both hope and resistance. As I heard it, the question is like, what does resistance look like in practice? Inquest, the magazine that I mentioned, is doing a year-long collaboration with a magazine you've maybe heard of called Truth Out. The basic project of which is capturing stories of basically abolition in practice on the ground and what that looks like in a very concrete way to make it less of a merely, or not merely, just abstract big idea, but rather it's a practice. There are people who call themselves abolitionists who are doing things. What does that look like? The first article in that series was about violence interrupters and tying back to guns. What does it look like to have a kind of fundamental reorientation of thinking about the role guns play in this, and what can people, including people who have been convicted of gun violence, do within their communities to address gun violence in a way that is kind of rejecting carceralism? And then on your question of hope, right up on our, I think we published it last week, there's this piece that we did called In Defense of Hopelessness by Charles Snyder. That's a really thoughtful meditation on not just the role of hope in struggles against mass incarceration, but also what to do if you've lost hope. And is there still a place for you in that fight? And his point is like, yes, absolutely. And in fact, we need to create more space for that because it's really important to find things that keep you hopeful. And also, we have to recognize that sometimes fights against massive systems that are causing such harm can feel hopeless. And we need to have the language to talk about what does it mean to still be engaged in a way that feels fulfilling in that work when hope is challenged. I think your question is the hardest question, because I just don't think there's a clear answer. Yeah. I spent yesterday for an hour with 2 students I'm hoping to write an article with that's just about this. I think it's just a dilemma. Mm-hmm. It is really hard to build new futures and challenge existing harm when building new futures takes so much longer than closing down.
And they're demanding
and
answers.
The demand is, right, it's the hardest problem. There is a decade temporal lag between the work of mitigation, deconstruction, opposition, and the world of imagination and building and construction. And during that time, you're just exposed because everyone then turns to you and says, well, you tore it down and where's the replacement? Mm-hmm. And I think it's the hardest thing. That's all I can say, is that I think it's the hardest thing, and that figuring out answers is really tricky. And the last point is just on Joni's, a phrase, if you all haven't heard it, that I just think is useful to call into mind, is this idea of carceral humanism. Which is a big picture idea for the ways in which talking about helping people, this goes back to the big dilemma that Melanie brought up on the table, being more humane, so sounds good. We want to be humane. We want to recognize the humanity of what's happening here. And also, it can be such a sort of stalking horse for carceral expansion, right? Let's get some Norwegian prisons. Let's build a lot more Norwegian prisons. No, let's not, right? All right, that's all I've got on the 3 questions.
Do you want to go? I mean, I think it's a question of like scale and timeline, right? So on I'm like a working bougie mom with a baby, right? Like I don't have a whole lot of time to go out and like change everything. But I do always have like $50 for Chicago Community Jail Support, which these people go out at night on weekends with a van full of snacks and bus passes and things like socks, and just offer support and community to people who are getting released from jail. In the winter, people who are released without their coats, right? And so, I'm always looking for the helpers, right? The people that are able to go out there and be on the ground. I'm going to back them up, right? That's like the teeniest thing, right? Can I bankroll this? And thinking about the timeline, I'm so glad you brought up Rikers, because that institution is so lawless, and I think we can actually learn a lot from the people who are running Rikers, because they are unhurried when it comes to doing things like stopping the violence at Rikers, reforming the practices of their corrections officers. They have all the time in the world. That deadline means nothing to them. These deadlines keep getting pushed back. So I think we can join them in playing the long game. And it is a fight. I don't want to be cheeky about it or like sunny at all. Like, it's terrifying, and the costs are immense of knowing, who's gonna die because that fight is taking so long. But I mean, again, a person I write about in my book, she continued to visit Cook County Jail until she was in her 90s. And she was kind of broken by the end of her life. She's like, we worked so hard to reform it, and we got a maximum security jail. But she still tried, right? And I think, like, again, just like clinging to that, like, we don't know what it could have been if she hadn't tried, and if all these other people hadn't tried. So, yeah, somewhere between do the tiny thing that you can do today to support the work of good people to the biggest thing, which is like continue to fight as long as you have to.
Wow, you guys, some of you are still here. That's amazing. Yeah, there's so many people who are already organized. So you don't have to invent anything. You just need to figure out who they are, what your issue is you want to spend your time on, and join them, right? That's why I put the Detention Watch Network, because they list all the coalitions, and then they list them by state, and then they list them by... So for detention, what is needed is eyes on the ground. So if you have time and you're interested in this issue, what they need, and they have things called visitation programs, is they need volunteers who will go do visitations to detainees that they've never met before and don't know, because having citizens who are not second-class citizens, who are not in this black box, go and see makes ICE nervous. Just you going and doing one visitation once helps to create a conversation in that institution about the fact that people are visiting. And it is a day-to-day issue for the people who are locked in there as to how they're treated. Some days are better than others, so these tiny things totally matter. So just find the people who are already doing the work. You don't, again, it's like there's such good people out there doing such amazing stuff. And I feel like you guys said great things for everything else. I mean, I think I'll say one thing that wasn't a question that out of the three that is something that's on my mind, if I'm permitted to end with this. So I'm here talking about immigrant detention. And I really do feel like it is important to have this conversation with these conversations. And I don't actually feel that it happens enough. And I also feel that your guys' perspective on what's legal and illegal and moral and immoral, like my side of the story needs that perspective. Because I feel like if you guys came and learned more specifically with the kind of legal apparatus you have already in your mind, you would bolster the arguments that the people are trying to make on, you know, and I know the immigration lawyers are already doing it, but they also might not have the kind of carceral lens in quite the same way. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over. I think we have some final words from Dana.
Okay, thank you. Hello? Can you guys hear me? Okay, good enough, whatever. Oh, there we are. I just want everyone to take a quick breath because I feel like we've heard a lot today and it's been heavy. So I'm gonna breathe, but. We would like to thank all of our speakers, Professors Lopez, Newport, and Crespo, for their brilliant and informative presentations. We would further like to thank Professor Leon for leading today's discussion and doing such a fantastic job of threading the needles that connect each of their work. We'd like to thank our students for their participation in the workshop and for sharing their learnings with us. And lastly, we would like to thank all those who joined in person and about 100 or so people who joined online for today's and last night's programs and demonstrating that discussions around carceral landscapes deserves a place here at the Graduate School of Design. We hope that the conversations held in this auditorium continue to take shape beyond this moment. We hope that you each leave feeling inspired to see changes in our built environment, especially among carceral landscapes. The issues discussed are systemic and deeply embedded in the lived experiences of system-impacted communities, and we must accept our collective responsibility in these systems and build towards more equitable and just futures. If any of you have any thoughts or feedback that you'd like to share with Lisa and I, we encourage you to reach out and continue the conversation. And thank you all again. We hope that you get home safely and have a great weekend ahead.